Hey guys, tonight we are going to do something a little different. We're not just going to talk about history, we're going to sit right into it. We're heading back to a time and place that feels both strangely familiar and deeply alien, late medieval Europe, a world teetering on a knife's edge. And a little heads up, this is not the fairy tale version with knights in shining armor. Honestly, given the general state of things, you'd be lucky to make it through the first week without a serious case of existential dread. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It truly helps the channel. Also, I love knowing where you're all tuning in from, so drop your city and the current time in the comments below. It's always a quiet thrill to see our little community scattered across the globe. Now, dim the light, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing in a city street. Not London, not Paris, just a city. It's late afternoon, and the light has that tired, golden quality, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. The first thing you notice is the smell. It's a complex cocktail, a blend of wood smoke, damp earth, roasting meat from a nearby cookshop, and the undeniable, pervasive scent of unwashed humanity and livestock. It's not necessarily foul. It's the smell of life unfiltered. You're standing on cobblestones, uneven and slick with things you do rather not identify. Look up. The buildings leaning towards each other, their timber-framed upper stories jutting out over the narrow lane, almost seeming to whisper secrets across the gap. They create a canyon of shadows, even on a bright day. Sunlight is a precious commodity here. You see a flash of color, a wealthy merchant's wife, her gown a defiant splash of crimson against the sea of earthy browns and dun-dyed wool worn by everyone else. You notice the way people look at her fabric, not just with envy, but with a kind of calculation. There were, after all, laws for this kind of thing. Some PTU laws. They work old strict regulations on who could wear what, dictating fabrics, colors, and trims based on your social rank. That crimson might be a little too vibrant, a little too close to what a noble is supposed to wear. Her husband's success is written on her back, but it's a statement that could easily get them a fine. Or worse, social ruin. The social order feels like a brittle, thin veneer, and everyone is acutely aware of the rules. Now listen, beneath the clatter of wooden cartwheels and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, there's a sound you can't quite shake, the tolling of a church bell. It's not a cheerful chime calling people to a festival. It has a slower, more mournful rhythm. It's a constant reminder of what this world has just endured. The Black Death. It's been a generation or two, but the ghost of it lingers in the very air you breathe. Everyone you see, every single person, is a survivor, or the child of a survivor. They live in a world that was, not so long ago, nearly emptied. This shared trauma hangs over everything. It has bred a deep-seated anxiety, a feeling that the world is fundamentally unstable, that God's favor is fickle, and that disaster could strike again at any moment without warning. This is the mainstream historical knowledge we all learn about the plague's aftermath. But it's the subtler things that really define your new reality. You notice the art inside a church isn't just about serene saints anymore. You see more depictions of skeletons, of the dance of death, where popes and peasants are all led away by a grinning corpse. There's a morbid fascination with the fragility of the human body. One moment you are here, the next you are dust. And here's where things get blurry, where the historians start to argue. Are you living in the final, decaying days of the Middle Ages, or are you witnessing the first, hesitant flickers of the Renaissance? The truth, you're in both. You can see a scholar hurrying by, a precious, hand-copied book clutched in his arms, full of rediscovered Greek ideas that are setting minds alight. But at the same time, you see a crowd gathering to watch an execution, their faces a mixture of piety and morbid curiosity. It's an age of immense contradiction. Faith is absolute, yet people fear the devil is winning. Knowledge is expanding, but superstition is rampant. There's a palpable tension in the air, a sense that the old certainties are cracking, but no one is quite sure what will replace them. You feel it in your own bones, a low, humming frequency of unease. The world feels breakable, and you can't help but wonder, if the world itself is so fragile, what does that make you? That question hangs in the air, heavier than the wood smoke. If the world is breakable, what does that make you for now? The thought is just an abstract worry, a philosophical little seed planted in the fertile ground of your anxious mind. You push it away. You have duties, accounts to check, perhaps a prayer to say or a meal to oversee. Life, for all its anxieties, is relentlessly physical. It demands your presence. You walk back to your quarters. The solid thud of your leather-soled shoes on the stone floor a comforting, familiar rhythm. But then, one morning, you wake up and something is off. It's not a sickness you recognize. There's no fever, no ache in your joints, no churning in your stomach. It's a feeling deep within your very substance, a coldness. Not the kind of cold that a warm blanket or a roaring fire can fix. This is a profound, internal chill, as if your blood has been replaced with cool, still water. You sit up in bed, and the movement feels wrong. Your joints don't feel supple and forgiving, they feel rigid, like hinges that could crack under pressure. You dismiss it. A bad night's sleep. A touch of the ague. You go about your day, but the sensation follows you, a silent, invisible companion. When you sit down in your heavy oak chair, you do so with an uncharacteristic slowness, a strange new caution you can't explain. You find yourself watching a servant pour wine into a fine Venetian goblet. You admire the way the light passes through the delicate material, the way it seems to capture and hold the ruby red of the liquid. It is beautiful, ethereal, and so very, very fragile. One careless gesture, and it would explode into 1,000 glittering shards. And in that moment, looking at the glass, the feeling inside you finally finds a name. The thought arrives, not in a frantic rush, but with a chilling, crystalline clarity. You are made of glass. It's not that you feel fragile like glass. No. You have become convinced with an unshakable certainty that your flesh and bone have undergone a terrifying alchemical transformation. You are now a being of silica, brittle and transparent. Suddenly, everything makes a horrible kind of sense. The internal coldness, it's the natural temperature of glass. The stiffness in your limbs, the inherent rigidity of your new material. This is where the mainstream understanding of medieval medicine comes into play. You wouldn't think you were just going mad. Your first thought would be to rationalize this through the accepted science of the day. The theory held that the body was composed of four liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and your health and temperament depended on their balance. Your strange condition would be seen as an extreme case of melancholy, caused by an excess of cold, dry black bile. The physician you deconsult would nod gravely, perhaps mention that this excess humor could, in theory, be cooked or burnt by the body's internal heat until it vitrified, turning to a glass-like substance. This was a well-known, if rare, symptom of profound melancholy. So you see, your delusion isn't just a random buzz, or thought, it's a conclusion drawn from a recognized, albeit flawed. It feels terrifyingly logical. And here's a weird little tidbit: the term for this state, melancholy, comes from the Greek mela in akol, literally meaning black bile. They believed it was a physical substance, a cold, heavy sludge produced by the spleen or liver that could clog up your mind and spirit, leading to sadness, fear, and in your case, a terrifying physical delusion. The world outside you hasn't changed, but your perception of it is now a nightmare. The hard-backed chair is a threat. The friendly pat on the back from an acquaintance is a potential death blow. You watch people move with a thoughtless, casual grace, and you are filled with a terror so profound it leaves you breathless. How can they stride and jump and lean with such reckless abandon? Don't they know they could shatter? But no, it is only you. You are the anomaly. You are the fragile thing in a world of blunt, unforgiving objects. And this brings us to a debate that historians and medical experts still argue about. Was the glass delusion a purely psychological phenomenon, a top-down problem where a troubled mind imposed a belief onto the body, or was there a bottom-up cause? Some have theorized that there could have been an underlying physical ailment, perhaps a neurological condition like peripheral neuropathy, or even the early stages of a disease like syphilis, that coldness, tingling, or stiffness, that coldness, tingling, or stiffness. In an era without modern neurology, the brain would struggle to interpret these bizarre signals, latching onto the most potent cultural metaphor available, the new, magical. and terrifyingly fragile material of glass. Was the mind tricking the body, or was the body tricking the mind? We may never know for sure. For now, though, you don't care about theories. You only know the cold, hard certainty of your own reality. You sit very, very still in your chair. Your servant approaches to stoke the fire, and you flinch, raising a hand. Be careful, you whisper, your voice thin and dreamy. Don't come too close. He looks at you, confused. But in your mind, you can already hear it. The terrible, crystalline sound of your own shattering. The servant freezes, his hand hovering over the iron poker. He sees the terror in your eyes, but he doesn't understand its source. To him, you are still flesh and blood, his master, perhaps just unwell or in a strange mood. To you, his simple, well-intentioned act of stoking the fire is a direct threat to your existence. The heat, the sudden movement, the proximity of that heavy iron till any one of these could be the end. This chasm between your reality and his is now the defining feature of your life. This private terror, however, is not just the burden of common men or wealthy merchants. It can creep into the highest echelons of society, into the very heart of a kingdom. And there is no more famous or tragic example of this than King Charles VI of France, a man who would come to be known as Charles the Mad. Let's leave your quiet, terrified room for a moment and step into the whirlwind of the French court at the end of the 14th century. Imagine yourself there. It's a place of constant noise, gossip, and political maneuvering. Power isn't just about armies and laws, it's about perception, performance, and presence. A king must be seen. He must be vigorous, decisive, a solid and reassuring anchor for his kingdom. Now, picture that King Charles VI. In his youth, he was known as Charles the Well-Beloved. He was handsome, athletic, and by all accounts, a capable ruler. But in the summer of 1392, on a military campaign, something snapped. Riding through a forest on a sweltering day, a loud, unexpected clang from a dropped lance sent him into a violent frenzy. He drew his sword and attacked his own men, killing several before he could be subdued. It was the first, terrifying crack in the facade of a sane and stable monarch. After this event, Charles's life became a series of unpredictable episodes of what we would now call psychosis, interspersed with periods of lucidity. And during one of his most profound and lasting bouts of madness, he became utterly convinced of the same chilling reality that now possesses you. He was made of glass. This is the historical fact that everyone knows about Charles V's illness. But it's the details of his delusion that are so poignant and strange. He refused to allow anyone to touch him, recoiling in horror from his own wife and children. He would sit for hours motionless, fearing that any sudden movement would cause him to fracture. Court life, with its endless ceremonies, processions, and physical interactions, became an obstacle course of imagined perils. He became obsessed with protecting his fragile form. And here is the specific, almost comically tragic, detail that illustrates the depth of his conviction. He had special clothing made. It wasn't just padded. According to contemporary chroniclers like N. Guerra and E. de Monstrelet, Charles had long iron rods desti de furs sewn into the lining of his garments. Imagine that. The King of France, walking stiffly through the Louvre Palace, his rich, velvet robes reinforced with a secret, rigid skeleton of iron. He was creating his own suit of armor, not against swords and arrows, but against an accidental bump, a clumsy servant, or an overly affectionate courtier. He was a prisoner in a cage of his own to protect his glass body from a world that refused to acknowledge its fragility. This strange behavior leads us to a fascinating little nugget of information that's less commonly known. Charles also, during one of his episodes, forgot his own name. He didn't know he was king. He would get angry when people referred to him as Charles, insisting his name was George's. He would run wildly through the corridors of his palace until he was exhausted, and for a period of months, he refused to bathe or change his clothes. The combination of these symptoms, the glass delusion, the amnesia, the erratic behavior, created a crisis for the entire kingdom of France. How do you govern when your source of authority, the divinely appointed king, believes he will shatter if you approach him with a document to sign? The royal physicians were at a loss. They tried everything their medical books suggested. They prescribed rest, pleasant music, and a controlled diet. They performed bleeding essence purges to rebalance his humors. They even brought in sorcerers and charlatans who performed bizarre rituals, all to no avail. The king's mind remained, for long stretches, a fractured and terrifying place. And this is where historians still debate the precise nature of his illness. Was it schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or perhaps a form of porphyria, a genetic blood disorder that can have severe neurological symptoms and was later suspected in the madness of King George II of England? Some have even suggested that the initial trauma in the forest was a form of post-traumatic stress or heat stroke that triggered a latent psychological condition. The diagnosis is shrouded in the mists of time, and trying to apply modern psychiatric labels to a 14th century king is a difficult, if not impossible task. We can describe the symptoms, we can analyze the impact, but the ultimate cause remains a mystery. What is certain, though, is the powerful image he left behind: a king, meant to be the solid bedrock of his nation, convinced he was the most fragile thing in it. His personal, internal sense of being breakable became a terrifying metaphor for the state of his kingdom, which was itself fracked by war with England and internal power struggles. The Glass King ruled over a glass kingdom, both threatening to shatter at any moment. The image of the iron-clad king is a stark and lonely one, but his solution, however strange, was born of royal resources. You, on the other hand, don't have a team of tailors at your beck and call to fashion you a suit of reinforced armor. Your methods for survival must be more subtle, more domestic, and in their own way, even more absurd. Your life is no longer about living, it's about not shattering. The first thing to go is your bed. The soft feather mattress, once a symbol of comfort and status, now feels like a trap. Tossing and turning in your sleep, a recipe for disaster. You might crack a rib, or worse, an entire limb might just snap off under the weight of a misrolled torso. So you start sleeping on the floor. At first, you lay down a few blankets, but even that feels too unpredictable. The ideal solution is a thin straw pallet laid directly on the hard, flat floorboards. It's uncomfortable, yes, but it's predictable. It's stable. You learn to sleep on your back, perfectly still, like a corpse in a tomb, waking frequently in the night with a jolt of panic, checking your limbs to ensure they're all still attached. Your morning routine, once a simple affair, becomes a painstaking ritual of controlled movements. To get up, you don't just sit up. You roll slowly, deliberately onto your side, draw your knees up to your chest, and then use your hands to push your torso upright, all while keeping your spine perfectly straight. Every movement is calculated. Every joint is a potential point of failure. Getting dressed is a nightmare. Forget tightly laced doubles or heavy woolen cloaks. You need loose-fitting garments. You wrap yourself in layers of soft, light linen like a precious object being prepared for shipping. You instruct just one to be near you to simply lay the clothes on top of you. No pulling, no tugging. The very idea of forcing your glass arm through a tight sleeve sends a spider of imagined cracks through your entire body. And then there's the simple act of sitting. Chairs are your nemesis. A hard, straight-backed wooden chair is a field of hidden dangers. What if you sit too quickly? What if a leg of the chair has a weak spot and it gives way? The resulting impact would be catastrophic. So you develop a technique. You approach the chair backwards, slowly, using your hands to feel for its edges. You lower yourself inch by inch, your muscles screaming in protest, until you make the most delicate contact possible. You are a statue. You do not lean back. You do not cross your legs. Your feet are planted flat on the floor. Your back is ramrod straight. This brings us to a well-documented precaution taken by many who suffered from this delusion, the fear of other people's behinds. This sounds like a joke, and it is faintly comical, but the logic is chillingly sound. A contemporary physician, Levinus Lemnius, wrote about a patient who was terrified that if someone sat down near him, their buttocks would somehow shatter his own. This poor soul would spend his days standing or carrying a small cushion with him at all times, which he would insist on placing on any chair before another person sat on it. He became a sort of self-appointed cushion bearer for the entire household, a figure of mockery and pity. For you, this means you start policing the seating arrangements of your own home with a frantic, obsessive energy. No one is allowed to sit with their back to you, and here's a little detail you might not consider sound. The world becomes a symphony of terrifying noises. A dropped plate in the kitchen isn't just an annoyance, it's a visceral, sympathetic vibration that you feel in your very core. The slamming of a heavy door is a shockwave that you are certain has induced microscopic fractures throughout your body. You begin to crave silence. You stuff your ears with wax or cloth. You demand that servants walk on tiptoe and speak in whispers. First to your house, then to your room, then to the silent, motionless space inside your own head. Historians and psychologists who study these historical accounts argue about the level of performance involved. Was it all an internal, genuine belief, or was there an element of social communication? Some scholars suggest that this extreme behavior was, in part, a way of physically manifesting an inner turmoil that had no other language. In an era where expressing deep emotional or existential distress was difficult, particularly for high-status men who were expected to be stoic, acting out this highly specific, bizarre delusion was a way of screaming for help. It was a way of telling the world, I am in crisis. I am fragile. I am fragile. Handle me with care, in the only symbolic language available to them. It's a contentious idea that the sufferer might be, on some subconscious level, performing their fragility, but it adds another layer of complexity to the puzzle. So you spend your days wrapped in cotton wool, real and metaphorical. You avoid all contact. You eat soft foods that require no vigorous chewing. You urinate standing up, sometimes into a funnel, terrified that the pressure of sitting would be too much. Your life has been reduced to a single, all-consuming goal to arrive at the end of each day in one solid piece. The irony, of course, is that in your desperate attempt to preserve your physical integrity, you have allowed your life, your social connections, and your own identity to shatter into a million tiny pieces. You built your fortress of solitude, a carefully controlled environment of stillness and silence. But you cannot eliminate the outside world entirely. A servant must bring watered-down wine. A family member, filled with concern, might insist on seeing you. And through the cracks in your self-imposed isolation, the world's reactions seep in, and they are as varied and confusing as your own condition. First, there are the looks of pity. Your wife, perhaps. She enters the room softly, her face a mask of gentle sorrow. She doesn't consulted priests and physicians, has prayed for your soul and for the restoration of your mind. She sees her husband, the man who once confidently managed an estate or a business, now flinching at the rustle of her dress. She sees a stranger. Her attempts to comfort you are, to your mind, acts of aggression. My love, just let me hold your hand, she might say, her voice trembling. You recoil as if from a hot iron, a sharp no, escaping your lips. The hurt in her eyes is palpable, but it is nothing compared to the sheer, existential terror that her touch represents. Her pity feels like a suffocating blanket, another weight threatening to crush your delicate form. Then comes the mockery. It's rarely overt, at least not to your face, but you hear it, the whispers of servants in the hallway, the snickering of stable boys in the courtyard. You catch the sideways glances, the quickly suppressed smiles. To them, your condition is a grand, ridiculous joke. Did you hear the master thinks he's a wine glass now? They mimic your stiff, careful walk. They tell stories, exaggerating your precautions until you become a caricature, a local legend of foolishness. The glass man, the title follows you, a mocking echo in the corners of your own home. This mockery confirms a deep-seated fear that your suffering is not seen as tragic, but as absurd. And this is where a fascinating piece of social history comes into play. The concept of madness in this era was not the sanitized, medicalized concept we have today. There was no clear line between being eccentric, being foolish, or being genuinely insane. A fool was a recognized social role, both at court and in the village. Sometimes they were seen as divinely touched, other times as simpletons for entertainment. You and your glass delusion teeter precariously on this line. Are you a man suffering a tragic ailment, or have you become the household fool? The uncertainty is a torment in itself. Beyond pity and mockery, there is a darker, More dangerous interpretation: demonic possession. This is the fear that grips the more pious members of your community. They don't see a medical problem, they see a spiritual one. A priest might be summoned. He won't approach you with a physician's calm inquiries. He will approach you with a crucifix, with holy water, with the conviction that a demon has taken root in your soul and is twisting your perception of reality. He will speak of pride, the original sin of reality, suggesting that your belief in being made of a pure, noble material like glass is a form of demonic vanity. He might ask you questions designed to trick the supposed demon into revealing itself. Does the name of Christ burn you? Does this holy relic cause you pain? Your genuine, fear-based reactions to his sudden movements and loud pronouncements are taken as proof of the entity within. The treatment for this is not rest and quiet, but exorcism. A terrifying prospect. A group of people holding you down, the ultimate shattering, shouting prayers and commandments at you, all in the name of saving your soul. Here's a specific, strange detail about how they thought about possession. Some theological treatises of the time suggested that demons could manipulate the vapors of the body. They believed that these vapors would rise from the stomach and digestive organs to the brain, affecting thoughts and perceptions. A demon, therefore, could intercept these vapors and taint them, creating melancholic illusions like believing you were made of glass. So, in the priest's mind, he's not just fighting a spiritual entity, he's fighting a physical process, a kind of demonic indigestion of the soul. And so you are trapped not just by your delusion, but by the interpretations of others. Your wife's love is a threat. The servant's laughter is a source of shame. The priest's piety is a promise of violent intervention. Each reaction, however well-intentioned or malicious, reinforces your isolation. They cannot enter your glass reality, and you cannot escape it. You are utterly, terrifyingly alone. This leads to a debate that still circulates among historians of medicine and culture. To what extent was the diagnosis a product of the patient's social standing? A king like Charles VI, while called the mad, was still the king. His delusion was managed, contained, and treated however ineffectively as a royal malady. But what about you, a wealthy merchant or a minor nobleman? Your family might try to hide your condition to avoid scandal. You'd have been whipped as a mole in Gara, or locked in a cage as a village lunatic. The illness is the same, but the reaction it provokes, and thus the lived experience of it, is entirely dependent on who you are. The label sickness, foolishness, or possession is a social verdict, not just a medical one. For now you are simply the man in the room, the monster in the mirror. You see the pity, the scorn, and the fear in their eyes, and it only confirms what you already know. You no longer belong in their world of flesh and blood. You are a thing apart, an object to be handled, talked about, and feared. The priest eventually leaves, shaking his head. Your family, desperate, turns from the spiritual back to the physical. They send for the most learned physician money can buy. He arrives not with a Bible, but with a leather bag filled with charts and strange-looking instruments. He doesn't smell of incense, but of cloves and dried herbs, a scent meant to ward off the miasma, the bad air believed to carry disease. He is a man of science, or what passes for science in this age. He won't use the word psychology. He won't ask about your childhood or your anxieties. He will approach your condition as a physical imbalance, a mechanical problem within the intricate machine of your body. He sits down, at a distance you deem safe, and begins his diagnosis with a series of questions. He asks about your diet, your sleep, the color and consistency of your urine. He might even ask to inspect your stool. These are not for shock value, they are crucial diagnostic tools in the world of human medicine. He is looking for evidence of what he already suspects is the root cause of all your troubles, an overabundance of mela in a called the black bile. This is the cornerstone of his medical understanding. The theory of the four humors, inherited from the ancient Greeks like Hippocrates and Galen, is the undisputed truth of medicine. Everything from a common cold to the most profound madness can be explained by the interplay of blood hot and wet, phlegm cold and wet, yellow bile hot and dry, and black bile cold and dry. Your symptoms, the fear, the sadness, the chilling internal belief that you are made of glass, are classic signs of a melancholic temperament gone wild. Your body is producing too much black bile, or it's failing to purge it properly. This humor by its very nature is cold and dry. What is glass if not the epitome of cold and dry to the physician? Your delusion is not a metaphor, it's the literal, physical manifestation of your humoral imbalance. Your body is so saturated with this cold, dry substance that your mind has accepted its properties as your own. He explains this to you with a calm, scholarly authority. He might even pull out a diagram, a zodiac man, showing how different astrological signs govern different parts of the body. Perhaps your birth under Saturn, the planet associated with melancholy, has predisposed you to this condition. It all sounds incredibly logical, a complete and self-contained system that explains everything. It offers a strange sort of comfort. Your problem is not a unique curse, but a recognized, if severe, medical condition. Now for the weird part. What is this black bar? Here's a bizarre little fact. Nobody has ever actually seen it. Despite centuries of bloodletting and purging, physicians never consistently isolated a unique, black fluid. They found dark, clotted blood, or the contents of the bowels, and labeled it black bile, but it wasn't a distinct bodily fluid, like blood or phlegm. It was, for all intents and purposes, a theoretical substance. A theoretical substance. A concept so powerful that it shaped medical practice for over 2 millennia without ever being empirically proven to exist. The doctor treating you has absolute faith in a substance that, from a modern perspective, simply isn't there. Based on this diagnosis, he prescribes a course of treatment designed to do one of two things: either purge the excess black bile from your system, or counteract its cold, dry nature with things that are hot and wet. The treatments are as logical to him as they are horrifying to you. First, the purges. He might prescribe powerful laxatives and emetics, herbs like hellebore, known as a violent purgative. The idea is to expel the corrupt humor from your body. The process would be physically grueling, leaving you weak and dehydrated, and doing absolutely nothing for your delusion. Then comes the bloodletting. The physician, or a barber surgeon he directs, would open a vein in your arm and drain a specific amount of blood, believing it would remove the excess black bile circulating in your system. For you, the glass man, the sight of a sharp lancet approaching your fragile arm is the stuff of nightmares. Next, he'll try to introduce heat and moisture. Your diet would be strictly controlled. No more melancholic foods like old cheese, red meat, or root vegetables. Instead, you'll be fed hot and wet foods: chicken, fresh fish, leafy greens, and dried fruit. You'll be encouraged to drink plenty of wine, which was considered warming. He might prescribe baths, steamy and scented with herbs like borage and balm, which were thought to gladden the heart and drive out melancholy. The moisture, it's all part of the therapy. But for you, a sudden change in temperature feels incredibly risky. What if the thermal shock cracks you? And this is where we encounter one of the great, long-running debates in the history of medicine: the Galenic tradition versus the rise of empiricism. The physician standing before you is a staunch Galenist. He relies on ancient texts and a theoretical system. He knows what should work based on the rules of the humors. However, the seeds of a new way of thinking are just beginning to sprout. Figures like Paracelsus would soon emerge, publicly burning the books of Galen and Avicenna, arguing that medicine should be based on observation and experience, empiricism, not just ancient theory. He and his followers would argue for chemical remedies, for treating the specific disease rather than the general humoral imbalance. But that revolution is still in its infancy. Your doctor is a man of the old school. He is treating the theory, not the patient cowering before him. So use it there, listening to his confident prescriptions, trapped between your own impossible reality and his equally rigid, theoretical one. He is trying to fix your broken machine with the wrong tools and a flawed manual, all while you're just trying to keep the delicate glass from shattering. The physician's remedies have failed. The purges left you weak, the dietary changes made you miserable, and the prescribed baths filled you with a unique terror of thermal shock. Your condition, your core belief, remains untouched. If anything, the physical ordeal has only reinforced it, making you feel even more fragile. You retreat deeper into your self-imposed prison of stillness. And it is in this profound quiet, that another of your senses becomes exquisitely, painfully heightened your hearing. The world which you have tried so hard to block out now insists on entering through your ears, transformed into a landscape of terrifying threats. Your auditory perception has been rewired by your delusion. You are no longer just hearing sounds, you are feeling their physical impact on your brittle form. Imagine you are sitting perfectly still in your silent room. The afternoon sun throws a long rectangle of light across the floorboards. From the street below, a horse-drawn car trundles over the cobblestones. To an ordinary person, it's a mundane background noise. To you, it is a low-frequency earthquake. You feel the vibrations travel through the ground, up the stone walls of your house, into the floor beneath you. You press your hands to your chest, convinced you can feel the resonant frequency in your glass torso, certain that a microscopic network of fissures is spreading through you with every jolt of the cart's wheels. Then, from the kitchen comes a sharper, more piercing sound. A servant, careless for a moment, drops a pewter pot onto the stone floor. The clang is not just loud, it's violent. It strikes you like a physical blow. You flinch so hard your muscles ache, a gasp of pure terror escaping your lips. In your mind's eye, you don't just hear the pot hitting the floor, you see a terrifying overlay, a vision of your own arm striking the table and exploding into a spray of glittering dust. The sound of the pot becomes the pre-echo of your own shattering. This phenomenon, where one sense triggers a response in another, is a real neurological condition known as synesthesia. While you wouldn't have a name for it, you are living in a particularly horrific version of it. Sound has become a tactile experience. A high-pitched laugh from a passerby feels like a needlepoint prick against your skin. The deep, resonant tolling of the church bell is a slow, rhythmic hammer against your ribs. And this brings us to a specific, well-documented aspect of the glass delusion: the terror of bells. Bells were the soundtrack of medieval life, marking the hours for prayer, celebrating weddings, warning of fires, and mourning the dead. You couldn't escape them, but for a glass man, the powerful vibrations of a great bronze bell were a direct and sustained assault. The French jurist Jean D. Rac wrote of a man who believed he was made of earthenware, a close cousin to your condition, and would run in terror whenever the church bells rang, convinced their vibrations would shatter him. You can picture this poor soul, hands clapped over his ears, sprinting through the streets in a panic that no one else could understand. For you, the call to prayer has become a call to terror. Here's a little-known fact about the soundscape of the past: it was both quieter and louder than our own. There was no constant, low-level hum of refrigerators, air conditioning, or distant traffic. Silence, true silence, was more common. But when sounds did happen, they were often sharper, more distinct, and carried further. The blacksmith's hammer, the cooper's mallet, the unmuffled shout of a street vendor, these sounds pierced the air with a clarity we've largely lost. This high-contrast auditory world is a minefield. The moments of deep silence only serve to make the sudden, sharp noises even more startling and terrifying. Your life becomes organized around avoiding sound. You demand heavy tapestries be hung on all the walls, not for warmth or decoration, but to muffle the outside world. You place thick carpets on the floors to deaden the sound of footsteps. You might even go so far as to order the straw to be laid in the street outside your house, a common practice to quiet the noise of carriages for the sick or dying. You are, in effect, trying to soundproof your existence. This hypersensitivity to sound adds another layer to the ongoing historical debate. What was the underlying cause of the glass delusion? Some modern researchers, looking at it through a neurological lens, have speculated that it could be linked to conditions that cause sensory processing disorders, like certain forms of autism or anxiety disorders. These conditions can involve hyperacusis, an extreme sensitivity to sound. If your brain is already receiving auditory input at a painful and overwhelming volume, it might rationalize that intensity by concluding you are made of a material that would resonate so powerfully like glass or a bell. Is it possible that the glass delusion was, for some, a pre-modern attempt to explain the unexplainable experience of a sensory processing disorder? It's a fascinating theory, though one that is impossible to prove. For now, the theory doesn't matter. All you know is that you are trapped in a vibrating, clanging world. You sit in your muffled room, your own breathing a roar in your ears, your own heartbeat a drum forecasting your doom. You have become a human tuning fork, resonating with the violent symphony of the world, waiting for that one final, fatal note that will bring it all crashing down. Let's step away from the echoing corridors of your own fear for a moment, and shift our focus. The glass delusion was not just a malady of kings running through palaces or merchants hiding in their bedrooms. It also found a home in the quiet, dusty corners of a library, in the minds of the very people who were supposed to be the guardians of reason and knowledge, the scholars. Imagine a different man. He isn't a king, and he isn't you. Let's call him Cosimo. He's a man of letters, living in Padua or perhaps Bologna. He is independently wealthy, having inherited a fortune from a father who was a wool merchant. But Cosimo has no interest in trade. His passion is for books. His villa is less a home and more a library. The walls are lined with shelves, groaning under the weight of precious manuscripts: Virgil, Ovid, a newly translated Plato, a controversial treatise on alchemy. This is his kingdom. For years, Cosimo's life has been a sedentary one. He spends his days hunched over a lectern, his eyes straining in the candlelight, his fingers stained with ink. He is the very picture of the scholarly melancholic, a type well recognized in his time. It was a common belief, stemming from Aristotelian tradition, that melancholy and intellectual brilliance were intrinsically linked. The same black bile that could drive a man to despair and madness was also thought-fueled genius, deep thought, and artistic creativity. It was a double-edged sword. The price of genius was a predisposition to sadness and strange thoughts. And so, one day, the price comes due for Cosimo. The familiar feeling begins, the internal chill, the sense of rigidity. And in his world, surrounded by fragile, priceless objects, delicate astrolabes, thin-spun glass beakers for his alchemical experiments, and the brittle pages of his beloved books, his mind latches onto the same terrifying conclusion. He is made of glass, but a scholar's delusion is different from a king's. Cosimo's fears are more specific, more academic. He isn't afraid of a courtier's clumsy embrace, he's terrified of his own books. What if a heavy tome of Aristotle, bound in leather and wood, were to sit from the shelf above his desk? He begins to rearrange his entire library, placing all the heavy folios on the floor and the lighter pamphlets on the high shelf. His relationship with his work changes. The act of writing, once a joy, is now fraught with a new, tentative grip, terrified that the pressure required to make a mark on the vellum will send a crack racing up his arm. He begins to dictate his thoughts to a secretary, pacing the room at a safe distance, his hands clasped behind his back. The physical act of creation has become too dangerous. Here we come across a truly strange and documented behavior associated with the glass delusion, something a scholar like Cosimo might devise. He becomes obsessed with the idea of being moved. He needs to travel from his study to his dining room, but the walk is a journey across a treacherous landscape. What if he stumbles on a loose floor tile? So he hires two strong, yet gentle servants. Their only job is to transport him. They would lay a large, flat plank of wood on the floor. Cosimo would lie down upon it, perfectly rigid. Then with painstaking slowness the two servants would lift the plank and carry him, like a fragile sheet of glass, to his destination. He is, in effect, treating himself like a precious manuscript being moved from one library to another. This brings in a quirky little piece of intellectual history. The scholars of the early Renaissance, the humanists, had a complex relationship with the physical body. On the one hand, they were rediscovering classical texts that celebrated the beauty and potential of the human form. On the other hand, their own lifestyle was one of quiet, mind-focused contemplation. Many, like Petrarch, wrote extensively about the conflict between the life of the mind, the vita contemplot divum, the lighter octava. They often saw the body as a distraction, a heavy, fleshy anchor holding back the soaring spirit. The glass delusion, for a man like Cosimo, can be seen as the ultimate, pathological expression of this conflict. His body has become so alien, so separate from his intellectual self, that it has transformed into an object, a fragile, burdensome, and inconvenient object that gets in the way of his real life, the life of the mind. And this leads to a debate that still fascinates intellectual historians. Was the scholar's melancholy a genuine medical phenomenon, or was it, to some extent, a fashionable affliction? To be melancholic was to be associated with genius. It was a sign of a sensitive, philosophical soul. Did some scholars, consciously or unconsciously, adopt a persona of the melancholic because it was the expected behavior of a great mind? The idea isn't that they were faking it, but rather that the cultural expectation created a framework through which they interpreted their own feelings of anxiety, stress, and depression. A modern academic might complain of imposter syndrome. A Renaissance scholar might interpret those same feelings of inadequacy and pressure through the lens of an excess of black bile, leading to a profound, soul-crushing melancholy. It's a classic chicken and egg problem. Did the melancholy create the scholar, or did the life of the scholar create the melancholy? For Cosimo, the debate is irrelevant. He is living the reality. He sits in his library, surrounded by the wisdom of the ages, yet his entire universe of thought has collapsed into a single, terrifying point. He is glass. The one thing he valued above all else. His mind has betrayed him in the most ironic way imaginable, convincing him that his body, the very vessel of that mind, is the most fragile and worthless thing in the world. We've seen this delusion take hold of a king, a merchant, and a scholar. We've explored the different ways they cope with their shared, terrifying reality. But we keep circling back to one central, glittering question: why glass? Why not wood or ice? Or paper? Why did this one specific material become the focal point for so much anxiety and madness for over 2 centuries? To understand, you have to transport yourself back to a time when glass was not the ubiquitous, cheap material it is today. You have to look at it through their eyes. For most of history, glass was a luxury item, rare and mysterious. It was the stuff of church windows and royal goblets. To you, in the 15th or 16th century, glass possesses an almost magical quality. First, consider its creation. It's born from a seemingly miraculous process of alchemy. You take common, worthless sand, you subject it to an almost hellish fire, and it transforms into something entirely new, a substance that is solid yet transparent, that can hold liquid yet is itself like frozen liquid. This process of transmutation, of turning the mundane into the magnificent, was a powerful concept in a world steeped in alchemy and symbolism. It mirrored the spiritual goal of purifying the soul. But this miracle had a dark side. If fire could create this new substance, what was to stop some other process, a humoral imbalance? A demonic curse from performing a similar transformation on the flesh of a human being. Now think about its properties. The most stunning, of course, is its transparency. You can see through it. In an era obsessed with the difference between outward appearance and inner reality, glass was the ultimate metaphor. It had no secrets. It was pure, honest. What you see is what you get. For a person suffering from a deep sense of guilt, sin, or inner turmoil, the fantasy of being transparent could be a bizarrely comforting one. To be made of glass meant your soul, your inner self, was laid bare, forgotten the world to see. There was no more hiding. This idea is a mainstream historical interpretation of the Delusion symbolism. The glass body represented a longing for spiritual or moral transparency. But this transparency had a terrifying flip side. It meant you were completely exposed with no defenses. Your inner workings, your very substance, were visible to all. This ties into the concept of fragility. Glass was, and is, the epitome of something that is simultaneously strong and incredibly weak. It can hold water, it can withstand heat, but one sharp, unexpected impact, and it doesn't just break, it shatters. This duality perfectly captured the anxieties of the age. Think about the world you're living in. It's an age of soaring ambition. The Renaissance is dawning. New continents are being discovered. Human potential seems limitless. Yet, it's also an age of profound insecurity. The Black Death has shown how quickly society can collapse. Religious wars are tearing Europe apart. The old feudal certainties are crumbling. Life feels both full of incredible new possibilities and terrifyingly precarious. The individual feels both powerful and profoundly vulnerable. What better material to symbolize this state of being than glass? It is the perfect embodiment of beautiful, brilliant fragility. Here's a lesser-known tidbit that adds another layer. The quality of glass was rapidly improving during this period. Venetian glass makers, in particular, were creating cristallo, a type of glass so clear and fine it was unlike anything seen before. It was a technological marvel. This new, ultra-refined, and incredibly expensive glass became a massive status symbol. To own Venetian glass was to own the 15th century equivalent of a luxury sports car. This meant that the idea of glass was tied up not just with fragility, but with wealth, status, and refinement. And this brings us back to a point we've touched on before, and one that historians still debate with gusto. Why did this delusion primarily affect the wealthy and educated? The common peasant didn't seem to think he was made of glass. The theory is that you had to be of a certain class to even have the luxury of such a sophisticated, metaphorical delusion. A peasant's life was one of hard physical labor. His body was a tool, something to be used and exhausted. Fragile object would be completely alien. But for a wealthy man, a prince, a scholar, a merchant whose life was less about physical survival and more about status, politics, and intellect, the body could be perceived as a more abstract concept. They were the ones who owned the fine glass goblets, who gazed through the glass windows, who could afford the leisure and education to engage in this kind of profound, introspective anxiety. Wasn't just a mental illness, it was a culture-bound syndrome, a sickness that could only take root in a very specific social and economic soil. So when you believe you are made of glass, you are not just subscribing to a random, bizarre idea. You are subconsciously tapping into a rich and complex network of symbols that everyone in your culture would understand. You are saying you feel transparent, exposed, valuable, refined, and in imminent danger of being shattered by a world that has become too harsh, too fast, and too unpredictable. It's the ultimate, tragic status symbol of a nervous aid. The idea that your delusion is a status symbol feels deeply insulting. You are not trying to be fashionable, you are trying to survive. Yet, the physician who diagnosed your excess of black bile, and the scholar who sees melancholy as a mark of genius, are both touching upon a powerful idea that has taken deep root in your culture, the link between intelligence and sadness. You are not just sick, you have a gentleman's disease, an affliction of the thoughtful mind. This concept isn't new. It stretches all the way back to the ancient Greeks. A text attributed to Aristotle, Problem XXX, poses the question directly: why is it that all men who have become exceptional in philosophy, politics, poetry, or the arts are clearly melancholic? As the single, influential questions set the stage for 2,000 years of associating melancholy with genius. The idea was that the same humoral imbalance, the pesky black bile that caused fear and despair in its worst forms, could, in moderation, stimulate the mind to profound and original thought. By the time of the Renaissance, this idea had been fully embraced and romanticized. The figure of the scholarly melancholic became a powerful archetype. Think of Albrecht Dürer's famous engraving, Mélancolier. It depicts a winged, intelligent female figure, surrounded by symbols of science and art, sitting in a state of gloomy, inactive contemplation. She is not mad, but she is paralyzed by thought. This was the image of the great mind at work, not active and joyful, but brooding, introspective, and touched by a divine sadness. You see this reflected in the literature and philosophy of your time. Marsilio Ficino, a leading Florentine humanist, wrote it. He argued that scholars, by their very nature, were prone to melancholy. Their sedentary lifestyle, their intense mental effort, their habit of staying up late by candlelight, all of these things were believed to generate an excess of cold, dry black bile. Ficino, a melancholic himself, didn't see it as just a curse. He reframed it. The planet of melancholy was also the planet of the highest, most philosophical minds. To be a melancholic was to be one of Saturn's children, destined for a life of deep thought, but also shadowed by a constant gnawing sadness. So when people look at you, the glass man, they don't just see a lunatic. The more educated among them see the tragic endpoint of a process they admire. They see a brilliant mind that has, perhaps, thought too much. A mind so powerful and sensitive that it has essentially burned itself out, cooking its own humors until they turn to glass. Your delusion becomes a perverted badge of honor, a sign that you possessed a mind of exceptional, and therefore dangerous quality. And here's a quirky little detail that shows how this idea permeated the culture. There were cures for melancholy that were specifically aimed at scholars. One popular recommendation was to avoid thinking too hard about a single subject. It was advised that a scholar should vary their studies, a little philosophy in the morning, some poetry in the afternoon, perhaps a bit of mathematics in the evening. The idea was to keep the mind moving, to prevent it from getting stuck in a melancholic rut. Another common prescription was simply to go outside and look at beautiful green gardens and flowing water, as these things were considered moist and temperate and could counteract the cold, dry nature of melancholy. The image of a brilliant but sad scholar being told to go touch grass is, amusingly, not a modern invention. This cultural romanticizing of melancholy explains why your family might treat you with a certain strange reverence, even in your madness. They might whisper to visitors, "He was always so clever, so sensitive. His mind was defined for this world." Your fragility is seen as a consequence of your refinement. But this brings us to a major point of contention for modern historians and sociologists. Is there any truth to this link between genius and mental illness? The mad genius trope is still incredibly potent in our own culture. We love the idea of the tortured artist, the brilliant but troubled scientist. Modern studies have explored links between creativity and certain mood disorders, like bipolar disorder, with some evidence suggesting a correlation. The idea that mental illness is a necessary price for genius is a dangerous and largely discredited romanticism. Many, if not most, brilliant minds are perfectly stable, and most people with mental health issues are not secret geniuses. The historians' debate centers on this: was the melancholy of genius in the Renaissance a real psychiatric phenomenon? Or was it a socially constructed role by creating such a powerful and attractive archetype? Did the culture of the time actually encourage sensitive or intelligent people to interpret any feeling of sadness or anxiety as a sign of their own special, saturnine nature? It's possible that the archetype created the condition, at least in its cultural expression, as much as the condition created the archetype. You, of course, are not concerned with these academic debates. You are living the curse part of the equation, not the genius part. The idea that your terror is just a side effect of a superior intellect is no comfort at all. What good is a brilliant mind if it insists your body is a fragile prison of glass? The romantic notion of the brooding scholar is a cold comfort when you're afraid to sit down too quickly. Your so-called genius has not elevated you, it has broken you. As you sit in your self-imposed stillness, another pattern begins to emerge, one that you might notice yourself, but is glaringly obvious to us looking back through the historical records. You are a man. King Charles VI was a man. The scholar Cosimo was a man. The cushion bearer, the man terrified of bells, all men. When we read the medical treatises and literary accounts of the glass delusion from the 14th to the 17th century, we are confronted with a striking demographic anomaly. The patients are almost exclusively male. Where are the glass women? This is not to say that women in this period didn't suffer from mental distress. They most certainly did. They were diagnosed with hysteria, with love sickness, with various forms of religious ecstasy or demonic possession. Their suffering was real, but it manifested in different, more socially acceptable ways for their gender. A woman might have fits, see visions of saints, or waste away from a broken heart, but she didn't, as a rule, seem to believe she was made of glass. This brings us to one of the most fascinating and fiercely debated questions surrounding this entire phenomenon. Why the gender imbalance? The answer seems to lie in the vastly different social pressures and expectations placed upon men and women of the upper classes, the very demographic that this delusion targeted. Let's consider your position as a man of a certain standing. Your identity is intrinsically linked to your public role. You are a patriarch, a ruler, a merchant, a scholar. You are defined by your power, your authority, your reason, and your ability to act upon the world. Your body is supposed to be a tool for asserting this authority strong, solid, and resilient. Stoicism is your expected emotional state. You are not supposed to show weakness, fear, or vulnerability. Now imagine that this public identity, this carefully constructed edifice of masculine authority, begins to crumble. Perhaps your business is failing, your political influence is waning, or you feel intellectually inadequate. You are experiencing a profound crisis of identity, a deep-seated feeling of failure and fragility. But you have no socially acceptable language to express this. A man of your station can't just break down and weep, admitting he feels powerless and scared. That would be seen as unmanly, hysterical, womanly. So, the theory goes, this internal sense of fragility and vulnerability gets displaced. It's too shameful to admit I feel fragile. So the mind performs a terrifying substitution: I am fragile. The anxiety is projected onto the physical body in a very literal, concrete way. The glass delusion becomes a masculine way of expressing profound vulnerability without having to use the emotional language of weakness. It's a cry for help coded in a bizarre, symbolic language that centers on the physical form rather than the emotional state. Your body becomes the theater for a drama your mind is forbidden to acknowledge. Here's a small but telling piece of evidence. Remember how melancholy, the root of your condition, was associated with the male genius. The female equivalent was often considered to be hysteria, from the Greek hystere meaning womb. It was believed that the womb could become light and dry and wander around the body, causing all manner of emotional and physical distress. So, from the very beginning, the medical framework was gendered. Male intellectual suffering was in the head, black bile affecting the brain, while female emotional suffering was in the body, a wandering womb. The lives of upper-class women were also vastly different. Their domain was the private, domestic sphere. Their identity was defined by their relationships as a daughter, a wife, a mother. While they were certainly not without power or influence, it was of a different, more indirect kind. Their bodies were already seen as more porous, more mysterious, and more subject to the whims of nature through menstruation and childbirth. Perhaps the idea of a radical, solid-state transformation into glass just didn't map onto their lived experience in the same way. Their culturally assigned fragility was emotional and social, not a rigid physical state. This leads to a really interesting, and still debated, academic argument. Some feminist historians have argued that the glass delusion is a prime example of what they call a protest psychosis. The term suggests that some forms of madness can be an unconscious form of social protest. In this view, the glass man is not just mentally ill, he is, on a deep symbolic level, protesting the impossible demands of Renaissance masculinity. He is radically rejecting the expectation that he be strong, solid, and aggressive. He is making himself unavailable for the roles of warrior, politician, or patriarch. It's a total, albeit self-destructive, withdrawal from the battlefield of male social performance. It's a controversial take, as it risks romanticizing a debilitating illness, but it forces us to see the delusion not just as a weird medical curiosity, but as a symptom of a deeply patriarchal society's discontents. So while you sit there, convinced of your unique, personal catastrophe, you are also, unwittingly, a data point in a much larger story about gender. The very nature of your fear, the specific material you've chosen, is a product of your time, your class, and your sex. A woman in the next room might be suffering just as deeply, but the story her mind tells her, the shape of her despair, will be entirely different. The prison of glass, it seems, was built primarily for men. The gendered nature of your fear is just one thread in a much larger tapestry of anxiety. You feel like the solitary, fragile man in a world of solid, unthinking people. But what if your personal, internal sense of being on the verge of shattering is simply a perfect, microscopic reflection of the world outside? What if everyone, in their own way, feels like they're living in a glass kingdom? Let's pull the focus out from your silent, fearful room and look at the grand, chaotic stage of 15th and 16th century Europe. The feeling that the world is cracking apart is not just in your head. First and most foundation ally, there is a crisis of faith. For 1,000 years, the Catholic Church has been the bedrock of European society. It is more than a religion, it is the sole provider of truth, the arbiter of reality, the guarantor of social order and eternal salvation. Its authority is meant to be absolute and unshakable. But now, you are seeing cracks appear in this mighty edifice. You hear stories of corruption coming from Rome. You hear about popes and cardinals living in decadent luxury, about the selling of indulgences certificates that supposedly reduce time in purgatory. Then a German monk named Martin Luther nails a list of complaints to a church door, and suddenly, the unthinkable happens. His ideas spread like wildfire, thanks to a revolutionary new technology, the printing press. Before, a dissenting idea could be easily silenced. Now, it can be replicated 1,000 times over and distributed across the continent in a matter of weeks. The result is a spiritual earthquake. The one true faith splinters into warring factions. Neighbors who once prayed together now eye each other with suspicion, accusing one another of being heretics destined for damnation. This isn't just a theological debate, it leads to brutal, bloody wars that will engulf Europe for more than a century. The very ground of certainty upon which your entire worldview was built has fractured. If you can no longer be sure of the path to heaven, what can you be sure of? This sense of spiritual vertigo, of losing the ultimate safety net, creates a profound, collective anxiety. Alongside this religious upheaval, the political landscape is also shattering. The old feudal order, a pyramid of loyalty with the king at the top and the peasant at the bottom, is breaking down. A new class of people, merchants, bankers, skilled artisans like you, perhaps, is rising in wealth and influence. They are challenging the traditional power of the landed aristocracy. Cities are growing, becoming powerful, semi-independent entities. The world is no longer a simple, static hierarchy, fluid and unpredictable scramble for power. Your own social standing, once fixed at birth, is now something that can be won or lost, creating both opportunity and a terrifying new insecurity. This is a well-established part of the historical narrative, the Reformation and the decline of feudalism. But consider a less obvious source of fracture: the discovery of the New World. An entire continent, filled with people and civilizations no one knew existed, suddenly appears on the map. This is not just a geographical discovery, it's a psychological one. It shatters the European conception of the world and their place in it. The Bible, the ultimate source of all knowledge, doesn't mention these people. The classical authorities like Ptolemy got the map completely wrong. If the ancients and the scriptures could be so fundamentally mistaken about the very shape of the earth, what else might they be wrong about? It's a dizzying realization that your entire inherited body of knowledge is incomplete and possibly flawed. Here's a small detail that captures this disorientation perfectly. For centuries, the biblical story of the three sons of Noah, Ham, and Japheth was used to explain the origins of the three known continents: Asia, Africa, and Europe. Now, suddenly, there's a fourth continent full of people. Where did they come from? Did they have souls? Were they even human? In the same way, theologians and scholars engaged in frantic, tortured debates trying to fit this new reality into their old framework. The old models work, racking under the strain of new information. So when you, in your quiet room, feel that your personal world is fragile and about to break, you are perfectly in tune with the times. Your delusion is not happening in a vacuum. It is a symptom of a collective cultural trauma. The feeling of personal disintegration mirrors the disintegration of the old world order. This is where a group of cultural historians makes a compelling, though still debated, argument. They propose that the glass delusion was a form of somatization on a massive scale. Somatization is a process where psychological distress is converted into physical symptoms. This theory suggests that an entire society, or at least its most sensitive members, can experience this. The widespread anxiety caused by religious, political, and geographical ruptures was so profound, so unsettling, that it had to find a physical outlet. It somatized into the bodies of men like you, who became living emblems of a fragile, fracturing age. You are not just a madman, you are a lightning rod for the anxieties of an entire civilization in turmoil. Your sense of being a glass man, isolated and unique in your suffering, is an illusion. Your brokenness is shared. It echoes in the splintering of the church, the crumbling of feudal loyalties, and the redrawing of the world map. You are a microcosm of a macrocosmic crisis. The whole world feels like it's made of glass, and everyone is just waiting to hear the sound of it shattering. This pervasive feeling of fragility, this sense that the world and the self are on the verge of shattering, doesn't just stay locked away in private homes or world chambers. It seeps out. It finds its way into the popular imagination, into the stories people tell each other to make sense of their strange and changing times. And there is no greater storyteller of this era than Miguel de Cervantes, the man who gave the world Don Quixote. While everyone knows the story of the knight who tilted at windmills, Cervantes wrote many other tales, and one of them features a character who would seem hauntingly familiar to you. In his collection of novel, as E.J. Emperor's exemplary novels, published in 1613, there is a story titled De Lias Nido v. Ideria, which translates to the graduate of glass or the glass or lawyer. It is the most famous literary portrayal of the glass delusion, and reading it is like looking into a strange, distorted mirror of your own life. The story follows a brilliant young scholar named Thomas Rodaya. He is intelligent, well-read, and has a promising career in law ahead of him. But his life takes a disastrous turn when a noble lady, spurned by his lack of romantic interest, decides to punish him. She gives him a poison quince, not to kill him, but to bewitch him into loving her. The potion backfires spectacularly. It doesn't fill him with love, it drives him mad. Tomas awakens with an unshakable conviction his entire body is made of glass. But here's where Cervantes adds a brilliant, satirical twist. While the Lias Nido's body is broken, his mind is sharper than ever. People start coming to him for advice. They ask him questions about law, politics, and morality, shouting them from a safe distance. And the glassman answers with a wit and insight that is almost that his replies are so clever, so brutally honest, that he becomes a kind of celebrity oracle, because he believes himself to be made of glass. He is transparently honest. He has no reason to flatter or lie. He speaks the unvarnished truth, and people are fascinated by it. This is the literary genius of Cervantes at work. He is playing directly with the symbolism. We've already explored the link between glass, transparency, and truth. The Lias Nido is a living paradox. He is physically incapacitated by his madness, yet intellectually liberated by it. He is a fool who is also a sage. Cervantes uses the delusion to satirize the hypocrisy of his society. The sane people who come to mock the glass man end up receiving lessons in wisdom from him. He is a specific, funny detail from the story. A boy throws a stone at him. The Lias Nido lets out a blood-curdled scream, not of pain, but of terror for his fragile form, and then proceeds to verbally dissect the boy's lineage, his character, and his future prospects with such devastating wit that the crowd roars with laughter and the boy runs away in shame. He can't be touched physically, but his words can strike like stones. Eventually, a friar manages to cure Tomas. He returns to his senses, puts on normal clothes, and re-enters society as Tomas Rodaya, the lawyer. But here was the tragic irony: no one wants his advice anymore. As a sane man, he is just another lawyer. They no longer see him as a source of brilliant, transparent truth. They saw his wisdom as a symptom of his madness. Unable to make a living or regain his former status, the cured Tomas joins the army and dies an anonymous death in battle. The story ends with the sad moral that society sometimes prefers a brilliant madman to a mundane sane one. The existence of this story tells us something crucial. The glass delusion wasn't just a private, hidden shame. It was a known phenomenon, a piece of cultural currency that a writer like Cervantes could use, confident that his audience would understand the reference. They knew about glassmen. The Lias Nido vi Ideria was not a bizarre fantasy, he was a recognizable, if extreme, social type. And this brings us to a historical debate about the relationship between art and life. Did Cervantes' story simply reflect a pre-existing condition, or did it help to shape and popularize it? Some have argued that the widespread publication and success of The Glass Lawyer might have actually created a script for some individuals suffering from mental distress. A troubled young scholar, feeling a sense of alienation and fragility, might read or hear about the Lias Nido vi Ideria and unconsciously model his own breakdown on this famous literary precedent. It's a version of the copycat effect. It's unlikely that the story created the delusion from scratch, but it may have provided a powerful and detailed template, contributing to its persistence in the cultural imagination for another generation or two. For you, the knowledge that your condition is famous enough to be the subject of a popular story is a strange and double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's a validation. You are not the only one. Your suffering is real enough to be written about. But on the other hand, it turns your private terror into a public spectacle, a form of entertainment. You are a character in someone else's story, a tragic, fragile figure for others to marvel at, pity, and perhaps even laugh at. The story of the Lias Nido vi Derira ends with a miraculous, if ultimately tragic, cure by a kindly friar. But for you, there is no friar with a magic potion. There is only the grim reality of your condition and the increasingly desperate attempts of those around you to fix it. When the gentle, humor-balancing remedies of the learned physician fail, the approach to your treatment is likely to become more aggressive, more desperate, and frankly, more terrifying. You have now been living as a glass man for a long time. Your family is exhausted. Their pity has frayed into impatience. The expense of your care, of your idleness, is mounting. They want a result, and in an age where the line between medicine, magic, and outright trickery was blurry at best, the cures they might turn to are born of a brutal, pragmatic logic. The prevailing theory becomes if your mind is trapped in a delusion, perhaps a powerful shock to the system can jolt it back into reality. This approach was famously advocated by the 17th century physician Thomas Willis, one of the fathers of neurology. He recounts the story of a man who believed his body was made of butter. This butter man lived in constant fear of heat, refusing to go near a fire lest he should melt. After all gentle methods failed, Willis prescribed a cure by stratagem. He instructed the man's servants to stage a fake emergency. They were to grab the butterman, drag him forcibly towards a massive, roaring fire, and hold him there as if they intended to melt him down. The man, according to Willis, was so terrified by this immediate, tangible threat of being roasted alive that his more abstract, delusional fear of melting was completely overwhelmed. The shock rebounded his senses, and he was apparently cured. You can see where this is going. Your family, hearing of such methods, might decide to try a similar approach on you. Their logic is simple and cruel. If you're afraid of shattering, then let's show you what real shattering looks like. Imagine this. One evening, two burly servants enter your room. They don't have the usual cautious deference. Their faces are set with a grim determination. Before you can react, they seize you. Your worst nightmare is happening. The rough hands, the sudden, violent movement. You are convinced this is the end, that you will explode into a million pieces. You scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. They drag you from your room, through the house, and into the courtyard. There in the center of the yard is a roaring bonfire, and next to it, a cart filled with glass old bottles, broken panes, discarded goblets. It's a glittering pile of everything you fear. As you watch in horror, a third servant takes a shovel and begins to heave the glass into the fire. The heat causes the glass to crack and explode with sharp, popping sounds. Then he takes a large iron hammer and begins to smash the remaining glass on the cobblestones. The noise is deafening, a symphony of shattering, a cacophony of everything you believe your body to be, being violently destroyed right before your eyes. They hold you fast, forcing you to watch and listen. See, one of them might shout over the din. That's just glass. It's not you. You are flesh and blood. This is a form of what we might now call flooding or exposure therapy, but executed with a terrifying brutality. It is a calculated act of psychological violence, all in the name of healing. And here's a little detail about these kinds of cures by stratagem. They often involved elaborate deceptions. The 16th century physician André de Laurens tells of a patient who, like you, believed himself made of glass, and also believed he was dead and refused to eat. The doctors, unable to persuade him, hired people to dress in white sheets and enter his room, pretending to be fellow ghosts having a feast. They talked loudly about how wonderful it was to eat in the afterlife, and the patient, seeing other dead people enjoying a meal, was supposedly tricked into eating and eventually recovered. So, would this bonfire of glass cure you? The historical accounts, often written by the very doctors prescribing these treatments, tend to claim success. They present these stories as proof of their cleverness and ingenuity, but modern psychiatric understanding would cast serious doubt on this. Such a traumatic event is just as likely, if not more so, to deepen your psychosis, to confirm your belief that the world is a violent, dangerous place determined to destroy you. Agree to anything just to make the horror stop. You might say, yes, I'm cured, I'm made of flesh, but the core delusion would likely remain, now buried under a fresh layer of trauma. And this points to a continuing debate among medical historians: how reliable are these historical accounts of cures? Doctors of the past, just like today, had a professional interest in presenting their methods as successful. They were essentially writing their own advertisements. The stories of dramatic, instantaneous cures make for a much better narrative than the sad, more common reality of a patient who simply continued to suffer, or was eventually locked away. We have the doctor's version of the story, but we almost never hear from the patient. We don't know if the butterman truly stopped fearing fire, or if he just learned to keep quiet about it to avoid being dragged towards the flames again. As the noise of the shattering glass echoes in the courtyard, and the heat of the fire blasts your face, you are trapped. They are trying to break the delusion by breaking your spirit. They believe they are saving you, but all you know is the terror of their touch and the horrifying sound of your own fragile substance being smashed to pieces. It's a cure that feels indistinguishable from the catastrophe it's meant to prevent. The fire in the courtyard eventually dies down. The servants release you, their faces expectant. They want to see the change, the dawning realization, the return to sanity. But you are just empty. The shock has scoured you out, leaving behind a quiet, humming terror, whether you outwardly renounce your delusion to appease them or retreat into a deeper, more resentful silence. A fundamental question hangs over your entire experience. What is this thing that has happened to you? Is it a madness in the way we think of it now, a random firing of faulty brain chemistry, or is it something else, something more like a cultural sickness? Let's step back from your personal trauma and look at it from a modern, anthropological perspective. This is where we move from what happened to what it means. The mainstream view, for most of the 20th century, would have been to retroactively diagnose you. A psychiatrist reading your case file might label you with schizophrenia or delusional disorder somatic type. They would see your belief as a bizarre delusion, a clear break from reality, a symptom of a universal brain disease that has existed throughout human history, just with different cultural window dressing. You are no different from a modern patient who believes a microchip has been implanted in their brain. The underlying pathology is the same, only the specific content of the delusion changes with the times. But in the latter half of the 20th century, a different idea began to take hold, championed by medical anthropologists and cultural historians. They proposed the concept of a culture-bound syndrome. This is a form of mental distress that is considered a recognizable illness only within a specific society or culture. It cannot be understood without understanding the cultural context in which it appears. The symptoms are a kind of symbolic language, a way of expressing distress that is only legible to people within that culture. From this perspective, your glass delusion is a classic example of a culture-bound syndrome. It's not a universal illness that just happened to pop up in Renaissance Europe. It's a condition that could only exist there and then. It required the specific confluence of factors we've been exploring: the symbolism of glass as a new magical and fragile material, the medical framework of the four humors, the philosophical link between melancholy and genius, the social pressures of masculinity, and the widespread anxiety of a world in religious and political turmoil. Take away any one of those elements, and the delusion ceases to make sense. Think of it like this: your mind, struggling with an overwhelming sense of distress, is trying to create a narrative to explain what's happening. The symptom pool available to it is determined by your culture. A modern person might draw from a symptom pool that includes ideas about technology, radiation, or government conspiracies. Your symptom pool contains black bile, demonic influence, and the miraculous properties of Venetian glass. You constructed your illness from the cultural raw materials available to you. Here's a specific and perhaps strange modern parallel. In parts of Southeast Asia, there is a recognized culture-bound syndrome known as Koro. Sufferers are gripped by a sudden and intense anxiety that their genitals are retracting into their body and that this retraction will lead to their death. It often occurs in small, localized epidemics. From a purely clinical, Western perspective, it's a bizarre delusion. But from a cultural perspective, it's understood as a manifestation of anxieties about sexual performance, fertility, and social standing expressed through a culturally specific bodily metaphor. Your glass delusion is the core of Renaissance Europe. This brings us to a major ongoing debate that strikes at the heart of psychiatry. Is mental illness universal, or is it culturally relative? The universalists argue that conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are brain diseases with biological roots, and they look broadly similar across all cultures, even if the details differ. The relativists argue that culture plays a much more fundamental role, not just in shaping the content of a delusion, but in shaping the very experience and structure of the illness itself. They would argue that calling your glass delusion schizophrenia is an act of colonization, imposing our modern categories on a past that had its own, equally valid ways of understanding suffering. The debate is far from settled, and most experts now take a middle ground, acknowledging that both biology and culture play crucial roles. So which is it for you? Are you a timeless schizophrenic in Renaissance costume, or are you a unique product of your age, a living embodiment of its specific fears and obsessions? The answer is likely both. You may well have a biological predisposition to psychosis, a brain chemistry that makes you vulnerable. But the specific form your psychosis takes, the intricate and detailed world of your glass delusion, is a story written by your culture. It is a collaboration between your brain and your historical moment. This doesn't make your suffering any less real. In fact, it makes it more profound. You are not just a malfunctioning machine. You are a sensitive instrument that has been broken by the resonant frequency of your own era. You are a song that M in place could sing. As use it in the aftermath of your family's brutal cure, you are a testament not just to the fragility of a single mind, but to the power of a culture to shape the very language of our deepest pains. The bonfire cure has failed. You've learned only to be more guarded, to hide the true crystalline nature of your reality from your tormentors. You feel utterly alone in your specific, fragile prison. But what if I told you that you weren't a part of a secret, unspoken brotherhood of the strangely transformed? In the annals of medical history from this period, you, the glass man, are the most famous member, but the club has other, even more peculiar members. Your delusion, as specific as it feels, belongs to a larger category of what physicians then called metamorphosis fantasies. These were cases where a melancholic patient became convinced they had transformed into something else, not just an object, but also an animal, while you drew the short straw of becoming a fragile, inanimate object. Some of your contemporaries had delusions that were, arguably, even more bizarre. Let's meet some of your fellow sufferers. In a nearby town, there might be a man who is convinced he is a wolf. He shuns human company, lives in the woods, and has been seen running on all fours and howling at the moon. This is a classic case of lycanthropy, a surprisingly common delusion in this era, often linked to witchcraft and demonic possession. Unlike you, his fear isn't of shattering but of his own bestial, uncontrollable urges. Then there is the man we briefly met before, the man made of butter. Robert Burton, in his encyclopedic 1621 masterpiece, The Anatomy of Melancholy, describes several such cases. These men lived in a state of constant, mild panic about temperature. They avoided not just fires but sunny days. They would flee from a hot room, certain they were about to be reduced to a greasy puddle on the floor. Their primary anxiety was about melting, about losing their form and dissolving into nothingness. The list gets stranger. Burton and other physicians of the period document a whole menagerie of transformations. There were men who believed they had become cockerelless, convinced they had a comb on their head and an urge to crow at dawn. They would flap their arms as if they were wings. There was a man who believed he was a nightingale and would spend his days trying to sing with perfect pitch. One of the saddest cases involved a man who was convinced he was a clay pot, an earthenware jug. He was just as fragile as you, but with an added earthy humility. He would constantly ask people to keep their distance, not because he was precious, but because he was a common, easily broken piece of pottery. And here is perhaps one of the most specific and wonderfully weird documented cases. A man in Padua became convinced he was a shrimp. more specifically, a roasted shrimp. He believed that if he were to pass water, the world would be engulfed in a second great flood. So he refused to urinate, causing himself immense physical pain and danger. His doctors, in a moment of inspired, if unethical, genius, staged an elaborate ruse. They set a nearby building on fire, rang all the city bells, and screamed that the whole town was burning down. They told the shrimp man that he was the only one who could save them, that he must unleash his flood to quench the flames. And so, with a great sense of heroic purpose, he finally relieved himself and was supposedly cured of his delusion. What this bizarre collection of transformations tells you is that your mind, in its desperate attempt to give form to your distress, is working from a shared, if strange, menu of possibilities. The underlying feeling might be the same as sense of alienation from your own body, a feeling of fragility, a loss of identity, but the final form it takes is wildly creative. This brings us to a fascinating historical debate. Why this sudden explosion of metamorphosis delusions in this specific period? Some historians link it to the resurgence of interest in classical texts, particularly Ovid's Metamorphosms, a collection of Roman myths about gods and humans transforming into animals, plants, and constellations. With the rise of humanism and the printing press, Ovid's stories became incredibly popular. It's possible that these vivid tales of transformation provided a new set of powerful images that seep into the collective unconscious, offering a template for the melancholic mind to latch on to. A troubled soul might not just feel beastly, they might feel like Lycaon, the king who was turned into a wolf by Zeus. So you see, your condition is not a freak occurrence. It's part of a pattern. You are the glass man, he is the butter man. Another is the wolf man, and a fourth is a roasted shrimp. Each of you has built a prison out of a different material, each with its own unique set of rules and fears. Your fear is of impact. The butter man's fear is of his own inner nature. The shrimp man's fear is of his own inner nature. You are all wrestling with the same fundamental problem, a profound disconnect between mind and body, a feeling that the self has become alien. It's a spectrum of delusion is, in a way, the most aristocratic, the most philosophical. It speaks of transparency, value, and a clean, sudden shattering. The butterman's is more domestic, a fear of slow, messy dissolution. The wolf's is primal and wild. Each delusion, the wolf's is primal and wild. Knowing this doesn't lessen your terror, but it might lessen your loneliness. Somewhere out there, in the darkness, another man is carefully avoiding a candle, convinced he's about to melt. Another is listening to the dogs howl and feeling a strange sense of kinship. Your suffering is personal, but your story is part of a larger, stranger, and more colorful anthology of human despair. The idea that you belong to a strange brotherhood of the transformed, the glass, the butter. The wolf might offer a sliver of camaraderie, but it doesn't solve your immediate problem. Your family's attempts at a medical cure, both gentle and brutal, have failed. Their patience is gone, and their fear is curdling into something darker. They are starting to wonder if your problem is not one of medicine, but of morality. Is this a sickness of the humors, or a sickness of the humors, or a sickness of the soul? And so, inevitably, they turn to the ultimate authority on all matters of the soul, the church. The priest who visits you now is different from the first one who came. The first one was concerned, perhaps a little fearful, but his primary tool was prayer. This new one is an inquisitor in spirit, if not an official title. He is a mamrain to see the devil's handiwork everywhere. He doesn't see a patient, he sees a potential vessel for demonic influence. He is not here to comfort you, he is here to interrogate you. His line of questioning is chillingly different from the physician's. He doesn't ask about your diet, he asks about your dreams. He wants to know if you've had visions, if you've spoken to spirits. He asks if you've ever renounced God, if you've attended a witch's Sabbath, if you've made a pact with a demon in exchange for what knowledge wealth. The priest might theorize that your delusion is the ironic fulfillment of a diabolical bargain. Perhaps you asked for a pure or perfect body, and the devil, in his malicious literalism, gave you one made of glass. Your terror is now reframed through a theological lens. Your fear of shattering is not just a psychological quirk, it's a form of spiritual pride. After all, Water's glass, it's beautiful, it's refined, it's almost angelic in its purity and transparency. To believe you are made of such a substance, the priest might argue, is the height of vanity. You are rejecting the humble mercy, flesh and blood body that God gave you. You are trying to elevate yourself above your station. Is the devil's favorite sin? Your condition is not a sickness, it's a punishment. This brings us to a major historical point: the great witch hunts that swept across Europe during this very period. The 16th and 17th centuries were the peak of the burning times. A pervasive paranoia about a vast satanic conspiracy had taken hold. The authorities, both secular and religious, were actively hunting for the devil's agents on earth. Your strange, inexplicable condition makes you a prime suspect. Your isolation, your bizarre behavior, your rejection of social norms, it all file. And here's a specific, terrifying detail about how they thought the devil worked. They believed in something called the malefic, i.e. a harmful act performed by a witch or sorcerer. This could be anything from causing a crop to fail to making a cow's milk run dry. A common form of malefic, was to induce a strange, wasting sickness or a form of madness. The priest might therefore conclude that you are not the sinner, but the victim. A witch in your village, perhaps an old woman you once slighted, has cast a spell on you, causing your mind to believe this terrible falsehood. The cure in this case would be to find and prosecute the witch responsible. Your personal tragedy could become the spark that ignites a local witch hunt, leading to the torture and execution of an innocent person. Either way, whether you are seen as a sinner or a victim, the focus is now squarely on the supernatural. The priest might try to perform an exorcism. This is not the gentle prayer of before, it is a spiritual battle. He will hold a crucifix to your face, splash you with holy water, the sudden cold a fresh air for your glass form, and command the unclean spirit to leave you. Your frantic, terrified reactions will be seen as the thrashing of the cornered demon, proof that the exorcism is working. The more you scream and struggle, the more convinced he becomes of his diagnosis. This is where a heated and long-standing historical debate comes to the forefront. What was the real relationship between mental illness and the witch hunts? The 19th century view, popularized by historians like Jules Michelet, was that the women accused of witchcraft were often simply mentally ill, and their confessions to flying on broomsticks or consorting with the devil were the products of psychosis. Modern historians have largely rejected this simplistic view. They argue that the vast majority of accused witches were perfectly sane individuals who were victims of social envy, misogyny, or political maneuvering. Their confessions were almost always extracted under extreme, unimaginable torture. However, it is undeniable that some people who were genuinely suffering from a mental illness, like you, to get caught up in the machinery of the witch hunts. Your delusion is so strange, so outside the bounds of normal human experience, that it practically invites a supernatural explanation in a world primed to see the devil everywhere. Are you being tested by God, like Job, or are you a pawn in a diabolical game? The line is terrifyingly thin, and the priest standing before you is the one who gets to draw it. He might conclude that your case is not one of possession, but of divine trial. Your suffering is a test of your faith, and the faith of those around you. This is, in a way, a more merciful verdict, but it offers no relief. It means your suffering has a purpose, but that purpose is God's, and it will only end when He decides the test is over. You are left in a state of limbo, a living testament to God's inscrutable will. A fragile object lesson for your community. Sinner, victim. Your body has become a battleground for forces far beyond your control. The priest eventually leaves, perhaps satisfied that you are a trial from God rather than a vessel for the devil, but this distinction brings you no comfort. You are left alone again in your quiet room, a fragile artifact in a world that has run out of ways to explain you. But outside your shuttered windows, the world is continuing to change. The religious fervor that fueled the witch hunts is beginning to wane, and a new, powerful force is rising in its place: reason. We are now drifting into the latter half of the 17th and the early 18th centuries. This is the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment, a period when thinkers across Europe began to champion the power of the human mind to understand the universe through logic, observation, and science. The old explanations, humoral imbalances, demonic possession, divine trials are starting to sound old-fashioned, superstitious. A new generation of physicians and philosophers is looking at the world and the human mind with a fresh, more skeptical eye. Imagine a new kind of doctor comes to see you. He is younger, dressed in the sober, practical fashion of the new era. He doesn't carry a bag of herbs or a zodiac chart. He carries a notebook and a keen, observant gaze. He is less interested in the ancient texts of Galen and more interested in the new anatomy of Vesalius or the physics of Newton. He sees the body not as a vessel of mystical humors, but as a complex and elegant machine. A machine that can, on occasion, break down. This new doctor would dismiss the idea of black bile as an unproven, ancient superstition. He would likely laugh at the notion of a wandering womb or a diabolical pact. He approaches your condition as a problem of mechanics, a malfunction in the machinery of the mind. The new thinking, pioneered by philosophers like René Descartes, had drawn a sharp distinction between the mind, the res cogit ans, or thinking thing, and the body, the res extensa or extended, physical thing. This new doctor would surmise is located firmly in the mind. Your body is fine, it's your thinking substance that has a faulty gear. The new vocabulary to describe your condition is all about nerves, spirits, and vapors, but these are now seen in a more mechanistic way. They aren't mystical essences, they are physical components. Thinkers like Thomas Willis, the same man who prescribed the Bottom-man cure, was also a pioneering anatomist of the brain. He was meticulously dissecting brains, tracing the paths of nerves, trying to map the physical structures of thought and emotion. He might explain your condition as a problem with the animal spirits, a very fine, vaporous substance believed to flow through the nerves, carrying sensation and commands from the brain. In your case, these spirits are disordered, agitated, or obstructed, leading your brain to receive faulty information and generate this bizarre, persistent illusion. Here's a specific, fascinating detail from this transitional period. The very concept of the nerves was changing. For centuries they were thought of as just simple cords. But with the invention of the microscope, people were starting to see that the body was made of much finer stuff. The idea of nervous fluid or vibrating nerve fibers became the dominant theory. Your delusion might be explained as a case of your nerves vibrating at the wrong frequency, creating a false sensation of glassy brittances. The explanation is still wrong by modern standards, but you can see the shift. The language is moving from the magical to the pseudoscientific. It's an attempt to find a rational, physical cause within the body for the troubles of the mind. This new, enlightened perspective also changed how society viewed you. You are no longer a moral spectacle, a sinner, or a saint. You are, instead, an object of scientific curiosity, a fascinating case study. The doctor who visits you might write about you in a letter to the Royal Society in London or the Academy of Sciences in Paris. You become the curious case of the gentleman who believed himself made of glass. Your suffering is anonymized, medicalized, and turned into data for the great project of understanding the human machine. This new rationalism also had a direct impact on the decline of the glass delusion itself. The delusion could only thrive in a world that believed in alchemy, metamorphosis, and the symbolic power of materials. It was a poetic, metaphorical illness. But the Enlightenment was, in many ways, an anti-poetic movement. It demanded clear, literal, evidence-based truth. In a world increasingly explained by gravity, mechanics, and chemistry, the idea of a man literally turning into glass started to seem not just tragic, but absurd and logically untenable. The cultural symptom pool was changing again. The raw materials for building such a fantasy were being discredited, thrown out with the alchemist's beakers and the exorcist's holy water. And herein lies a contentious point for historians of science and culture. Did the light of reason really cure society of such delusions, or did it just replace them with new, more scientific-sounding ones? The Enlightenment certainly swept away many old superstitions, but it also gave rise to new forms of medical dogma. The focus on nerves and mechanics led to its own set of bizarre theories and harsh treatments. The debate continues. Was the Enlightenment a great leap forward into the light, or just a sideways step into a different kind of darkness, one where the soul was replaced by the machine and the patient by the case study? For you, this gradual shift in the intellectual climate means your delusion is becoming obsolete. It's a relic of a more superstitious, more imaginative age. The world is moving on, finding new ways to be anxious, new metaphors for its fragility. And you, the glass man, are being left behind, a strange, transparent ghost haunting the dawn of the age of reason. The world keeps turning, and the light of reason, as they call it, gets brighter and harsher. The 18th century rolls on, full of coffee houses, political pamphlets, and a growing confidence in the power of the human intellect. And in this new, brightly lit world, your strange, shadowy condition begins to fade away. The glass delusion becomes, for lack of a better term, unfashionable. It becomes an old fart's madness. By the mid-1700s, you will find fewer and fewer new cases being documented by physicians. The great encyclopedias of madness and melancholy written in this period, like those by the Scottish doctor William Cullen, might mention the glass delusion, but they treat it as a historical curiosity, a bizarre example of the follies of a less enlightened age. It's listed alongside lycanthropy and demonic possession as a type of insanity seldom met with nowadays. The diagnosis has, in effect, been retired. So why did it disappear? What changed so fundamentally in the cultural soil that this peculiar flower of madness could no longer grow? We've touched on some of the reasons, but let's lay them out. First, and perhaps most importantly, the medical model shifted completely. The theory of the four humors, which provided the logical underpinning for the delusion cold, dry black while creating a cold, dry glass-like state, was definitively abandoned by mainstream medicine. The new science of pathology, based on autopsies and the study of diseased organs, found no evidence of black by law the other humors. You can't have a humor-based illness in a world that no longer believes in humors. The very language that gave your delusion its medical legitimacy was erased. In its place came the new nerve theory. All forms of mental distress were now attributed to weak nerves, nervous sensibility, or disorders of the nervous fluid. This became the new, fashionable diagnosis, particularly for the wealthy and educated, the same demographic that once suffered from the glass delusion. A sensitive, artistic man of the late 18th century wouldn't believe he was made of glass. He would complain of a nervous disposition or a fit of the vapors. The underlying anxiety might be the same, but the acceptable cultural script for expressing it had changed. He was no longer fragile like glass, his nerves were. Second, the magic and symbolism of glass itself had changed. Thanks to industrial advances, glass was becoming more common, more affordable, and less mysterious. It was no longer just the stuff of Venetian goblets and cathedral windows. It was being used for more mundane things: bottles, window panes in ordinary homes, scientific instruments. The material was losing its alchemical mystique. It was becoming a commodity. It's hard to build a profound, existential delusion around a material that is also used to make a beer bottle. The metaphor had lost its power. Here's a small, telling detail about this shift. In the 19th century, with the rise of industrialization and steam power, a new kind of delusion began to appear in asylums: patients who believed they were made of cast iron, or that their bodies were steam engines on the verge of exploding. The metaphors for mental distress are always drawn from the cutting-edge, powerful, and slightly terrifying technology of the day. You were a product of the age of alchemy and craftsmanship. The new madmen were products of the age of the factory and the machine. And this leads to the most compelling, and still debated, explanation for the delusion's disappearance. This is the core of the culture-bound syndrome theory. Like a fad or a fashion, a culture-bound syndrome has a life cycle. It appears when a specific set of cultural anxieties and symbols align. It flourishes for a time because it provides a legible script for suffering, and then it fades away when those anxieties and symbols are replaced by new ones. It was the perfect expression of the transition from the medieval to the early modern world. It captured the sense of personal fragility in an age of religious and political shattering. But by the time of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, the anxieties had changed. The big questions were no longer about the salvation of the soul, but about the place of humanity in a mechanistic universe. The fears were not of demonic influence, but of social alienation, of being a cog in a vast, impersonal machine. A new era needed new neuroses. The glass delusion, with its poetic, gothic horror, simply couldn't compete. It was an analog delusion in a world that was becoming digital. Historians who track the frequency of diagnoses call this looping effects. The way we classify and talk about mental distress affects how people experience and report it. When doctors stopped diagnosing the glass delusion and writers stopped writing about it, a troubled person no longer had being made of glass as a ready-made option for their breakdown. The script was retired, and the actors learned new lines. So you are left, a ghost at the feast of reason. Your children and grandchildren will live in a different world. They will have their own anxieties, their own fashionable diseases of the soul. They might read about your condition in an old book and find it quaint, almost comical. They won't understand the deep, resonant terror of it because they don't speak its symbolic language. They won't understand that your fear of shattering was just a very personal expression of a universal human dread, the fear that the self, the world, and all the things we hold certain are far more breakable than we dare to admit. The curtain has fallen on your particular tragedy. The curtain has fallen, the script is retired, and you, the glass man, have become a footnote in dusty medical texts. The world moved on, lit by gas lamps and powered by steam, and your particular brand of fragile terror seems like a relic from a distant, superstitious past. But is it truly gone, or has it just changed its clothes, found a new mask to wear? If we look closely in the mirrors of our own modern world, we might just catch a glimpse of your reflection, a faint, transparent echo of your old fear. The glass delusion in its literal form has vanished. You will not find a patient in a modern psychiatric hospital who is being treated for the unshakable belief that their body is made of silica. The cultural and medical soil is no longer fertile for that specific seed. But the core anxieties that gave it life, the fear of fragility, the sense of being exposed, the disconnect between mind and body, are perennial. They haven't disappeared, they have simply been re-diagnosed and re-metaphored. Consider the modern diagnosis of body dysmorphic disorder (BDD). This is a condition where a person becomes obsessed with a perceived flaw in their appearance, a flaw that is either minor or completely invisible to others. They might spend hours a day looking in the mirror, consumed by the belief that their nose is crooked, their skin is blemished, or their body is misshapen. It is a disorder of perception. Like you, they see a truth about their physical form that no one else can see. Their flaw becomes the organizing principle of their entire life. They avoid social situations, their relationships suffer, their world shrinks. Does this sound familiar? It's your obsession, your social withdrawal, just focused on a different aspect of the body. You feared your body's substance, they fear its surface. Or think about the language we use today to describe emotional pain. We talk about feeling shattered after a tragedy. We say our hearts are broken. We describe a vulnerable person as fragile. We warn someone in a delicate state to handle with care. This is the mainstream, accepted vocabulary of emotional distress. These are just metaphors now, of course, but they are the direct descendants of your literal belief. You were the living embodiment of the metaphor. Your delusion was so powerful, in part, because it was an exaggeration of a feeling that everyone at some point understands. The ghost of your glass body lives on in the very words we use to speak about our pain. And here's a more specific, modern echo that is eerily resonant. There is a phenomenon in modern medicine known as somatic fragility. It's not a formal diagnosis, but a concept used to describe patients, often elderly, who have a profound and sometimes delusional belief in their own physical vulnerability. They become terrified of falling, convinced that even a minor bump will result in a catastrophic injury. This fear leads to a drastic reduction in their mobility. They become bedridden, not because they are physically unable, but because they are paralyzed by the fear of their own fragility. They have, in essence, developed a kind of functional glass delusion, a terror of shattering that is just as real and debilitating as yours. This brings us to a fascinating and ongoing discussion in the world of psychology and cultural studies. Are we seeing the return of the glass delusion in a new guise? Some thinkers have argued that our modern, digital world is creating a new kind of glass self. Through social media, we live increasingly transparent lives. Our thoughts, our relationships, our daily activities are put on display for all to see. We curate a perfect, glittering image of ourselves. But we live in constant fear of that image being shattered by a single bad photo, a cruel comment, a public shaming. We have become, in a sense, fragile digital avatars. This digital glass delusion theory posits that we are more vulnerable than ever to a sense of being constantly watched, judged, and on the verge of social collapse. The feeling of being exposed that you felt in your very substance, we now feel in our online personas. The fear of being broken by a harsh word is a daily reality for many. It's a contentious theory, of course. Critics would argue it's a glib comparison that trivializes the terror of a true psychotic delusion, but the parallels are hard to ignore. The core fear of a transparent, fragile self being shattered by the outside world seems to be a recurring theme in the human condition, one that simply adapts its form to the technology and anxieties of the age. So while the physician with his nerve tonics and the psychoanalyst with his dream interpretations would find your case a historical curiosity, they are still treating your descendants. They are treating the person whose body has become an object of anxiety, the person who feels dangerously exposed to the world, the person whose internal sense of self has become terrifyingly fragile. Your name is gone from the diagnostic manuals, but your story is still being written over and over, in the language of new fears. You are the original, the prototype, the ghost in the machine of modern anxiety. The story of the glass delusion is a story of men. Of a king, a scholar, a lawyer. But as the 17th century waned, taking the delusion with it into the twilight of history, it seems fitting that one of the last, most poignant recorded cases was that of a woman, a princess who lived a life as strange and fragile as the condition that haunted her. Let's travel to the glittering, formal world of the court of Brunswick-Lumberg in what is now Germany. It is the late 1600 seconds. The world is changing, but the life of a high-born princess is still one of rigid protocol and gilded confinement. Here we meet Princess Alexandra of Bavaria. She was not a direct sufferer of the glass delusion in its classic form, but her own unique delusion is its direct and fascinating cousin, a final, sorrowful grace note in this strange symphony of fear. Princess Alexandra was, by all accounts, a beautiful, intelligent, and deeply devout young woman. She was also intensely anxious and obsessive. From a young age she was gripped by a fixation on cleanliness and purity. She would wear only white, insisting that any speck of dirt was a sign of a deep spiritual stain. Her attendants were driven to distraction, constantly changing her clothes, scrubbing her chambers, trying to create a perfectly sterile environment for a princess who felt perpetually unclean. As she grew older, this obsession took a stranger, more specific turn. One day, she announced to her horrified family that she had, as a child, swallowed a grand piano made entirely of glass. A full-sized, glass grand piano. This is where her delusion diverges from yours but remains in the same family. You believed your entire body was glass. She believed she had ingested a large, fragile, and incredibly precious object that was now lodged permanently within her. Her fear was not that her entire body would shatter, but that this internal would be broken by any sudden movement. Her life became a performance of extreme caution, a warped echo of the precautions you and your fellow glassmen took. She would walk sideways, convinced that if she walked straight, the great glass piano would get stuck and shatter inside her. She would turn corners with a painful, geometric slowness. She avoided sitting down abruptly and refused to be embraced or even touched, for fear the impact would break the delicate keys and strings of the instrument she carried within her. This is a mainstream, though often overlooked, piece of royal history. Princess Alexandra's case is a well-documented example of a somatic delusion in the high aristocracy. What makes it so fascinating is its specificity. Why a piano and why a glass one? The piano was still a relatively new and exciting instrument at the time, a symbol of culture, refinement, and artistic expression. By claiming to have swallowed a piano, Alexandra was, perhaps, symbolically expressing a feeling of being filled with a beautiful, complex, but ultimately unplayable music. It could be seen as a metaphor for a suppressed artistic or intellectual talent, a great potential trapped and silenced within the rigid confines of her role as a princess. The fact that it was a glass piano is the direct link back to you. It connects her personal, unique delusion to the larger cultural phenomenon that was just then fading away. The glass element adds that familiar layer of extreme fragility, preciousness, and transparency. She wasn't just carrying a burden, she was carrying a beautiful, priceless, and incredibly vulnerable secret. Here's a small, poignant detail about her life. Despite her debilitating delusion, she was a talented writer and translator. She established a literary and cultural circle at her court and was highly respected for her intellect. This deepens the tragic irony. She was a woman of immense creative and intellectual capacity, who was simultaneously convinced her body was encumbered by a silent, fragile, glass instrument. The conflict between the life of the mind and the perceived limitations of the body, which we saw in the Scholicosimo, finds its final, melancholy expression in Princess Alexandra. And this brings us to a historical debate about the end of an era. Was Princess Alexandra's case truly one of the last gasps of this type of poetic delusion, or does the fact that she was a woman change the interpretation? Some historians argue that her delusion, focused on an internal object rather than the entire body, is a subtly different, more feminine version of the affliction. While the glass men feared an external impact shattering their public, male bodies, her fear was internal, contained, a secret carried within the private space of her female body. It was a delusion about ingestion and interiority, which aligns more closely with historical tropes of female maladies like hysteria. It can be seen as a bridge between the old glass man delusion and the newer, more internalized nervous disorders that would come to dominate the 18th century. It's impossible to know for sure. Princess Alexandra never recovered from her belief. She lived out her life walking sideways through the halls of her palace, a living museum of a fading fear. She is a sad, beautiful, and fitting end to the story. The glass delusion, which began with a mad king in a suit of iron, ends with a gentle princess, terrified of breaking the glass piano she believed was trapped inside her. The last ghost of glass has finally quietly left the stage. We have traveled a long and strange road together, from the court of a mad king to the mind of a princess with a glass piano lodged in her soul. We've seen this fear through the eyes of merchants, scholars, and doctors. We have watched it flare up, become a cultural phenomenon, and then fade into the pages of history. Now, as our journey nears its end, it's time to step back and ask the final question. What was the recipe? What were the essential ingredients that, when mixed together in the crucible of late medieval and early modern Europe, produced this unique, glittering, and terrifying concoction, the glass delusion? Think of it as a kind of historical alchemy. You can't create the glass delusion without a very specific set of cultural, medical, and psychological components. Remove any one of them, and the potion fails. Ingredient number 1: the material. As we've seen, glass itself was the crucial starting point. You need a society where glass is both a known substance and a source of wonder. It has to be common enough for people to understand its properties, but rare and expensive enough to possess a magical, high-status aura. It must be transparent, beautiful, amicable, catastrophically fragile. This combination of qualities made it the perfect objective correlative for a mind struggling with feelings of worth, exposure, and vulnerability. Without the unique symbolic weight of glass in that specific era, the delusion would have had no anchor. Ingredient number 2: the medical framework. You need a system of medicine that can make the impossible seem logical. The theory of the four humors was the perfect catalyst. The concept of a cold, dry black bile accumulating in the body and vitrifying a person's substance provided a rational, scientific-sounding explanation for an irrational belief. Physical ailment. Without the phantom of black bile, the glass delusion would have been just a bizarre fantasy with no medical legs to stand on. Ingredient number 3: a culture of melancholy. The soil in which the delusion grew was fertilized by the Renaissance obsession with melancholy. The idea that sadness and genius were linked, that the greatest minds were the most vulnerable to despair, created a high-status, romanticized framework for mental suffering. It particularly resonated with the wealthy, educated men who were the primary sufferers. It allowed their breakdown to be interpreted not as a simple failure of mind, but as a tragic, almost noble consequence of their superior intellectual and spiritual sensitivity. This gentleman's disease context was essential. Ingredient number 4: a world in crisis. Personal anxiety needs to be fed by collective anxiety. The delusion flourished during a period of profound social, political, and religious upheaval. The Protestant Reformation shattered the unity of Christendom, the decline of feudalism fractured the social order, and the discovery of the New World broke the old maps of reality. This created a pervasive background hum of uncertainty and a sense that the entire world was fragile and cracking apart. The personal feeling of being made of glass was a perfect microcosm of this macrocosmic instability. Ingredient number 5: a specific notion of selfhood. This is a subtler but crucial ingredient. You need a culture where the self is beginning to be seen as an individual, interior entity, separate from the community, but where the language for describing internal psychological states is still underdeveloped. The rise of humanism put a new focus on individual experience and identity. But without a modern vocabulary of psychology, a profound identity crisis, a feeling that one's self is fragile or inauthentic, had to be expressed physically, somatically. The body became the stage for a drama about the endangered self. This is a point historians of emotion still actively debate. How did people in the past experience their inner lives? Did they have the same sense of a unified, interior self that we take for granted? Some argue that the very concept of a deep, private self was a gradual invention. The glass delusion can be seen as a crisis point in that invention, the terror of having a newly discovered self that feels frighteningly breakable. So you mix these 5 ingredients together: the magic of glass, the logic of the humors, the romance of melancholy, the trauma of a fracturing world, and a new, vulnerable sense of self, and you get the glass delusion. It was a perfect storm, a unique historical moment where all the pieces fell into place to create one of the strangest chapters in the history of the human mind. Take away just one ingredient and the recipe changes. In a later era, with a different medical model, you get nervous disorders. In a different technological age, you get delusions about being a steam engine or a computer. The human capacity for suffering and anxiety is constant, but the form it takes, the story it tells, is a product of its time and place. The glass delusion was the story Europe told itself about its own fragility for a few brilliant, terrifying, and transparent centuries. The recipe is complete. The historical analysis is done. We've taken the delusion apart and put it back together, ingredient by ingredient. But now, let's zoom in one last time, past the history, past the theories, back to the simple, quiet, human experience. Back to you. You are still sitting in your room. The world outside has moved on, but you are still here, in this timeless moment of fear. What does it all come down to? In the end, it comes down to a crack. A crack in the very idea of you. We walk through the world with a fundamental, unspoken assumption that the person in here, inside your head, is the same as the person out there, the body that moves and breathes and interacts with the world. We assume a seamless unity between mind and body, between our internal sense of self and our physical form. It's the most basic contract of existence. Your tragedy, and the tragedy of all the glass men, is that this contract has been broken. For you, the eye who thinks and feels and fears has become a terrified observer, trapped inside a body it no longer recognizes. The body is no longer me, it has become it. An object, a fragile, alien thing that has to be managed, protected, and feared. This is the core of the experience, a profound and terrifying depersonalization. You look at your hand, you see a piece of sculpted, translucent material that could shatter at any moment. You have become a stranger to yourself. This disconnect creates a bizarre cascade of logical consequences. If your body is an object, then it no longer belongs to the world of inanimate things, and it must obey their laws. The law of glass is that it breaks. Therefore, you must live in constant anticipation of this law asserting itself. Your life becomes a painstaking, moment-to-moment negotiation with a flawed and terrifying physics. Think about the sheer exhaustion of it. Every single, simple act, sitting, walking, eating, sleeping, is no longer automatic. It is a complex problem to be solved, a risk to be calculated. The mental energy required to simply exist is immense. The world, which for most people is a stage for action, becomes for you a gallery of potential threats. A friendly handshake, a solid chair, a sudden noise, they are all imbued with a menace that no one else can see. You are living in a horror movie that only you are watching. And this is where we touch upon a deep, philosophical question that the glass delusion forces us to confront. What is the self? We like to think of it as a solid, stable, continuous thing. But your experience shows that it is anything but. The self is a story we tell ourselves, a fragile coalition of memories, sensations, and beliefs. And like any story, it can be rewritten. Your mind, under the pressure of distress, has rewritten your story with a terrifying new plot twist. You are no longer the hero, you are the fragile object at the center of the drama. This idea is something that historians of psychology and consciousness still grapple with. Is there a true self underneath all the layers of culture and experience, or is the self nothing more than a collection of learned scripts and narratives? The case of the glass delusion suggests that the self is far more malleable and culturally conditioned than we are comfortable believing. You are a stark reminder that our sense of who we are is not a given, it's a constant, and sometimes desperate, act of creation, and sometimes that creation can go terribly wrong. You didn't choose this. You didn't ask for your mind to betray you in this specific, artistic, and cruel way. But in your silent, fearful vigil, you became a living monument to a question we rarely dare to ask us. You force us to consider the terrifying possibility that the person we think we are, the solid, reliable me that we present to the world, is itself a kind of illusion. A beautiful, functional, but ultimately fragile construction. You are the proof that with the right combination of pressure and fear, any of us could, in our own way, begin to see the cracks. Your suffering wasn't for nothing. In your silent, shattering fear, you held up a mirror to the anxieties of your age. And for us, looking back, you hold up a different kind of mirror, one that reflects the inherent fragility of the human sense of self. It's a sobering, unsettling thought, but one that is essential to understanding the strange, breakable creatures that we are. The cracks in your sense of self feel ancient and profound, a timeless era. Yet, the very words we use to describe these feelings, the language of our own modern fragility, are deeply rooted in the world you inhabited. You are the ghost in our vocabulary. When we talk about being broken by grief or shattered by trauma, we are speaking your language, whether we know it, whether we know it, whether we know it. Let's trace the lineage of this language. The idea of a nervous breakdown, a cornerstone of 20th century psychological parlance, feels like a modern, almost mechanical concept. But its roots are entangled with your story. Remember the shift in the 18th century from humans to nerves. Physicians began to see the body as a system of fibers and tubes through which animal spirits or nervous fluid flowed. Madness and distress were seen as a problem with this delicate plumbing. The term they used was nervous disorder. A person of delicate nerves was seen as being more susceptible to the shocks and stresses of the world. Their nerve fibers were thought to be too tightly wound or too weak, liable to snap under pressure. This is the direct ancestor of our modern idea of being highly strung or feeling like our nerves are shot. And what were the primary symptoms of this nervous disorder? An overwhelming sense of anxiety, a feeling of physical weakness, and a hyper-awareness of one's own body and its fragility. It was, in essence, the glass delusion stripped of its poetry and given a new, pseudo-scientific gloss. The fear of shattering was replaced by the fear of snapping nerves. The patient was no longer a precious, breakable object, but a faulty, delicate machine. The core feeling of fragility remained the same, only the metaphor had been updated to fit the new mechanistic age. Here's a specific and fascinating etymological link. The word neurotic, which became so central to Freudian psychoanalysis in 20th century culture, was coined in 1790 by the Scottish physician William Cullen. He created it to describe this very category of nerve-based illnesses, so when we talk about neuroses, we are using a term born directly out of the same cultural shift that made your glass delusion obsolete. The neurotic is the modern heir to the glass man. But the lineage goes deeper than just the language of nerves. Think about the phrase to be heartbroken. Today it's a powerful but purely metaphorical description of emotional pain. But in your time, the connection between emotions and the physical heart was considered much more literal. The heart was not just a pump, it was the seat of courage, love, and passion. A profound emotional shock was believed to be able to cause a literal physical breaking or bursting of the heart. Medical treatises from the period describe autopsies where physicians claimed to have found the ruptured hearts of people who had died of grief. So when you, the glass man, feared a physical shattering from an emotional or physical shock, you were not far removed from the mainstream belief that a strong enough emotion could physically break the body's most vital organ. Your delusion was simply a full-body version of the common fear of a broken heart. This leads to a debate that continues among linguists and historians of emotion. Does our language simply describe our feelings, or does it actively shape them? The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis famously argues that the language we speak influences how we perceive and think about the world, applied to emotions. This would suggest that having words like shattered, broken, and fragile in our emotional vocabulary actually provides us with a framework for experiencing and understanding our own distress. In this view, the legacy of the glass delusion is not just a collection of quaint metaphors. It is a foundational part of the very toolkit we use to construct and communicate our experience of suffering. You and your fellow sufferers, in your extreme and literal interpretation of fragility, help to forge and solidify a language of pain that has endured for centuries. You were the pioneers of psychological brokenness. Even a modern, seemingly scientific term like psychological trauma has a ghost of your world within it. Trauma comes from the Greek word for wound. For centuries, it referred exclusively to a physical injury. It was only in the late 19th century that the term was fully adapted to describe a purely psychological wound. This shift from a physical wound to a mental one is the very journey that the concept of fragility has taken. It started as a literal physical fear in men like you, and it has evolved into a powerful metaphor for the wounds we cannot see. So, the next time you hear someone say they feel shattered, or that they're falling to pieces, listen closely. You might just hear the faint, crystalline echo of a man in a quiet room, terrified of a sudden noise, convinced that his very substance is about to break. Your fear has not been forgotten. It's all around us, hidden in plain sight, in the very words we speak. And so we stand at the threshold. The journey is over. The air in your quiet room no longer hums with a crystalline terror. It's just air. The chair in the corner is just a chair, made of wood and leather, not an instrument of potential destruction. The light slanting through the window no longer seems to threaten you with thermal shock, it just warms the floorboards. The story has run its course. The delusion has dissolved, not with a bang, but with a long, slow, silent fade. We have to leave this world behind, and its fears are not our own. We were only ever visitors, borrowing your body and your terror for a short while to understand something of what it meant to be you. Let's gently close the door on this room, on this life. As we pull it shut, the sounds of the past begin to muffle: the distant clang of the blacksmith, the rumble of the cart on the cobblestones, the mournful tolling of the church bell. They all recede, becoming faint and then silent. The thick, earthy smell of the city gives way to the familiar scent of your own room in your own time. The glass delusion didn't die a dramatic death. It quietly retired. It became a piece of historical trivia, a curiosity for antiquarians. This is the mainstream understanding by the 19th century. It was well and truly gone from the medical landscape. And here is its final, sad indignity. A little-known fact about its afterlife: the glass man became a stock character in sensationalist pamphlets and cheap almanacs. He was lumped in with stories of two-headed cabs and prophecies of doom. He became a freak, a piece of morbid entertainment, utterly stripped of the profound psychological and cultural tragedy that defined his existence. Your reality was turned into a punchline, and that transformation from a living terror to a historical curiosity is, perhaps, the final and most definitive shattering of all. The delusion could not survive in a world that refused to take it seriously, that could only see it as a buzz of folly of the ignorant past. This brings us to one last, quiet question, one that historians and philosophers of history sometimes ask themselves in the late hours of their research. Why do we do this? Why do we visit these past worlds of suffering? Is it just intellectual tourism? A morbid curiosity about the strange ways people used to go mad? Some argue that the ultimate goal is to find patterns, to understand the universal laws of the human mind by studying its variations. They believe that your story, and others like it, are data points in a grand project to map the landscape of human consciousness. But perhaps the reason is simpler and less academic. Perhaps we come back to these places to practice a kind of radical empathy. To remind ourselves that the people of the past were not just characters in a story, they were real. For you, this was not a culture-bound syndrome or a fascinating case study. It was your life. The fear was real. The terror of a sudden movement was real. The loneliness was real. By spending this time with you, we affirm that your experience, however strange, mattered. We honor the reality of your suffering by trying for a few brief hours to understand it. We can't save you from your fear, but we can bear witness to it. And in bearing witness, we connect with something fundamentally human that transcends time. The fear of being broken. Now the door is closed. The past is quiet. Your story is over. Let it, and you, finally rest. The story has now concluded. The journey is at its end. The sounds and textures of that other time have faded, leaving only the quiet of this present moment. The air in your room is still and calm. The hum of the fan is just a soft, steady whisper, a gentle breath in the stillness. The world of the glass man has dissolved back into the mists of history, and you are here safe and whole, drifting on the edge of sleep. Think of the light from your phone or your screen as the last embers of that bonfire in the courtyard, now cooling to a soft, harmless glow. The worries of the day, the worries and the lists, have all softened, their details blurring like watercolor in the rain. There is nothing left to analyze, nothing to fear. The narrative has reached its peaceful conclusion. The voice you have been listening to is now just another sound in the quiet symphony of the night, blending with the rustle of sheets and the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. You can feel a pleasant weightlessness beginning to settle in your limbs, as if you are floating in calm, deep water. The story we shared was an anchor, holding you to the waking world for a while. But now the rope has been untied. You are free to drift. Let the remaining thoughts in your mind become like clouds passing across a moonlit sky, distant, indistinct, and of no consequence. They appear, and then they move on, leaving only a clear, peaceful darkness behind. You are returning to yourself, to the quiet, unbreakable sanctuary of your own deepest rest. The journey is complete. The shore of dreams is near. The end of the article. Good night.